Well, hello and welcome to the Drydock episode 347, part 2. There's still plenty more questions to get going with. Who knows, we might even see a part 3. Depends how loquacious I get answering some of the questions. But nevertheless, let's get on with the ones we've got at hand. If the gods had meant us to be happy, they would have given us a honey-based alcoholic beverage. Oluk Mead asks, in your video on cruiser and destroyer actions in World War II, part 2, particularly the Terrigo convoy, you state, and I quote, in keeping with the tradition of tribal class destroyers whose captains and crews were sourced from only the finest free-range asylums in the Empire, how did the Royal Navy ensure that only such choice lunatics were chosen as crew members and captains, and how did they choose mentioned asylums to recruit from? So, getting to the sort of root of the question, the Royal Navy actually had a fairly definitive and fairly rigorous selection process for the captains of tribal class destroyers, because if you look at the general destroyer fleet in the mid to late 1930s and early part of World War II, you'll notice that the most common rank of someone who is in charge of a Royal Navy destroyer is Lieutenant Commander. There are a few lieutenants even in charge of some destroyers, but it's broadly speaking a mix of lieutenants and lieutenant commanders. Now, back in the First World War, it would have actually been lieutenants, and the lieutenant commanders would be the slightly rarer ones, but destroyers have gotten a little bit bigger. And once you account for the old torpedo boats and so forth, there were slightly fewer of them in the interwar and World War II period, so it made sense that they'd be a slightly more prestigious command. However, if you look at who was in charge of the tribals at the start of World War II and in their initial commissions as well, you'll notice that there's basically no even lieutenant commanders in those ranks. They're all commanders or full captains. And then when you look through the command history of most of them, you'll see that almost all tribal class captains had actually commanded at least one, usually two, possibly more destroyers before they got their tribal class command, and in some cases they might have actually been in command of multiple ships, just the destroyers would have been the more recent ones. Now, of those tribals that survived to the latter part of the war, sometimes towards the latter part of the war there were lieutenant commanders put in charge of them, but that more reflected just the general expansion of the Royal Navy's destroyer fleet as a whole, thanks to obviously the building efforts in World War II, and also to a certain degree the appearance of some newer and potentially even larger destroyers. And remember that because this is the 1930s the tribals are built in, you're talking about them being a very small exclusive club of, if you like, max-size destroyers, which are only permitted in small numbers under the treaty system, as opposed to the more regular smaller destroyers, which make up the bulk of the fleet. So, given their size and prestige, what the Royal Navy did was essentially go, okay, well, we are going to assess the command record of various officers once they have already commanded existing destroyers. Now, of course, to be selected for destroyer command in the first place, you have to have a certain measure of aggression and willingness to get up and go. But then the Royal Navy would be looking at your record once you actually have command of one or more destroyers in your service career and go, okay, you are, reasonably aggressive, and therefore we shall keep you in destroyer command. Or maybe if your rank has advanced far enough, we might put you in command of one of the more forward-placed cruisers, a more independent command. And we thought you were aggressive, but actually you're a little less aggressive than we'd like, so maybe we'll move you off to the more fleet escort cruiser commands, or put you on a capital ship command track, because, one, you won't be in command of a battleship for a good few years, but two, it'll probably suit you a bit better. And then they'd look at the remaining group and go, right, so you basically treated your destroyer like a personal attack powerboat with a lot of weapons strapped to it, and essentially chose violence whenever violence was in any way, shape or form an option. You're going on a tribal class. And while, as with any fleet destroyer, there would be a certain number of green crew aboard a tribal, you kind of see a parallel process going on with the rest of the crew, in that you have a higher percentage of longer serving sailors aboard tribals, And more generally, of course, to a certain extent, the captain shapes the crew. So if you have an extremely aggressive captain in charge, then fairly soon the kind of crew who aren't really all on board with that kind of strategy and tactics will request transfers or just be transferred to other ships, whereas those who, are quite willing and perhaps looking forward to the idea of a hard-charging ship to serve on might actually be requesting transfers to the tribals. And thus you end up with the early war tribal class having a well-deserved reputation for near berserker levels of aggression in the face of the enemy. Grummancat asks, considering the Ballard Lusitania expedition and the whole theory about the coal dust exploding, can we find examples in history where a ship was destroyed in battle because her largely empty coal bunkers were blown up? It sounds like a magazine explosion, but without the magazine, perhaps setting aside USS Maine as she was not actively in combat. I don't believe there are any records of ships being confirmed destroyed by coal dust in their bunkers exploding in the middle of combat as a result of a hit. The closest to the USS Maine loss, for example, would be something like HMS Bulwark, seen exploding here, where you had the magazine set off by heat transferred through, although in that case it was most probably heat transferred from the boiler room rather than from a coal bunker fire. The main issue with finding a ship that exploded in this manner in battle is simply that, well, firstly, not all that many ships actually exploded in battle, and for those that did, well, for the British battlecruisers, for example, we know roughly what the cause of that was, and it wasn't their coal bunkers. And in large part, that's because in the era of coal-powered ships, you don't really have diving shells. So with the coal bunkers generally positioned below the waterline and or behind the armour belt, the kind of hit that's likely to set off a coal dust explosion in a bunker is going to be a torpedo hit. And then, now you're factoring down to coal-powered ships sunk in some way, shape or form by a torpedo that also exploded. And at that point, at least in terms of large capital ships, where you have a detonation almost commensurate with the arrival of the torpedo, you're essentially down to SMS Pommern. And it's generally held that one of her secondary magazines cooked off, causing her destruction. Now, the reason why you don't really see this kind of explosion taking place is, well, there's multiple reasons. Firstly, coal bunkers aboard warships, even battleships, generally tend to be a little bit more subdivided than you get aboard ocean liners. Secondly, even with a pre-dreadnought, there's usually a little bit more between the outer hull skin and the coal bunkers than there is on an ocean liner. And so that means, one, less explosive force is going to reach the coal bunker as compared to a torpedo hit on a merchant vessel. Two, once that diminished force reaches the coal bunker, there's just less of it, less volume. And of course, as anybody who knows much about particulate explosions knows, the more volume, the exponentially larger the explosion. Three, you've also got to account for the fact that different navies have different qualities of coal. So if people have a really damp, horrible, sticky bituminous coal like the German Navy, for example, it's probably not going to have much in the way of dust around that's going to jump up and explode. You want a finer, drier coal for that. So it further limits the subset of ships that could be vulnerable to all of this. And third, whereas Lusitania was at the tail end of a very long voyage and therefore had quite extensive empty dust-filled bunkers, the vast, vast, vast majority of warships that go into battle are going to have relatively full bunkers because, well, there's very, very few warships in the world that will actively go into combat when they're running short of fuel and therefore have big empty bunkers. And so a theoretical hit, most likely from a torpedo, is going to start up most likely a whole bunch of solid coal rather than a big empty void full of dust. So when you take all those factors into account, you suddenly end up with a vanishingly small and, as far as I'm aware, pretty much non-existent set of circumstances that all have to align to get a warship to explode due to a coal dust fire or coal dust explosion. Rodney McCoy asks, if at the end of the Spanish-American War, during negotiations of the Treaty of Paris, the US had demanded not only Puerto Rico, Guam and the Philippines, but also demanded the Canary Islands, the Balearic Islands, and the autonomous cities of Ceuta and Melilla, how would the European powers have reacted to this, in particular the British and the Royal Navy? I think you most likely would have seen something that actually occurred a few times in various peace negotiations in the 19th century, a great powers intervention, i.e. various other great powers, basically the big European nations, essentially muscling in on the negotiations and going, no, hold up. You don't get to be that demanding. Yeah, and essentially impose themselves as arbitrators, and there wouldn't have been a huge amount that either side could have done about it. I mean, as I said, it had happened before. There was precedent. Now, of the choices, I mean, all of them would not make a huge amount of sense because they're on the other side of the Atlantic. I mean, okay, fair enough, the Philippines are on the other side of the Pacific, but pretty much every major power had some degree of colonial ambitions in Southeast Asia at that point, so most people kind of went, oh, yeah, okay, they want to get on the table as well. Whereas the Balearics, the Canaries, and the little tip of Morocco, those had been Spanish possessions for a very, very, very long time, and to a certain degree, I think the Spanish certainly would maintain that they are actually part of Spain. And demanding to carve off bits of what is fundamentally seen as the home country, yeah, that meets a lot more resistance both from Spain and from the other powers as compared to we want to snap up some of your colonies. Again, that has precedent all the way back to the Age of Sail, where people would quite happily seize colonies and trade colonies back and forth during wars and peace negotiations all the time. But everyone acknowledged that if one side or the other started grabbing bits of mainland insert country here, it was a much more serious issue. And since you asked particularly from a British perspective, American control of the Canaries, well, all of them, I think the main question that the Royal Navy would be asking is, why? Why do you want these? Because realistically speaking, they're not going to make you any money, which is what colonies are supposed to do, at least on paper. So, prestige? Well, again, they're pretty small. They don't really give you all that much prestige, which leaves strategic implications. So, the implication being the US Navy wants to get involved in European politics, particularly Mediterranean politics, and much as the US likes its Monroe Doctrine saying everyone keep out of America, collectively the European powers would turn around and say, well, hang on a minute, if you want to maintain that, you keep out of European areas as well. So looking at the three, with all that said, the least offensive to the Royal Navy, i.e. the one they're most likely to go, we don't really care, is the Canary Islands, because okay, it's a small set of potential island bases off the northwest coast of Africa, potentially troublesome for trade along the coast of Africa, but broadly speaking, they're not a great strategic position with which to influence European politics, apart from just being somewhat closer to Europe than mainland USA. Then you'd have the Balearics. Now, the Balearics would be a lot more problematic because they're actually in the Mediterranean off the eastern coast of Spain. So that gives the US Navy a foothold in the Mediterranean the same way that the British have, for example, Malta. And yeah, there's a lot more potential for direct intervention and escalation there. So that would meet a huge amount more resistance. And then finally, you have those little cities on the north coast of Morocco. The Royal Navy would absolutely, I think, draw a line and just go, nope, not a chance. Because the Royal Navy really likes controlling the Gibraltar Straits. Now, Spain having those cities, not really much of a problem, because ultimately, well, Spain controls pretty much the rest of the coastline around the Straits of Gibraltar that isn't actually Gibraltar, so it doesn't really change anything for them having a little bit of control over the southern side. Whereas as a separate navy, and one that by its actions of actually taking control of it is expressing its desire, at least everyone else would see, to exert some control over the Gibraltar Straits, that would be a big no-no in the Royal Navy's books. They essentially would be saying, no, we're the only ones who get to control the Strait of Gibraltar. The Spanish are really a bit too weak to do much about it, so we kind of let them be nearby. But a navy that might actually, and appears to be wanting to, exert its own control, no, this is not happening, not in any way, shape or form. Wade Enyart asks, at what point, if any, during World War II did the Japanese begin to regard the Allies as something other than cowardly and soft? It varies hugely across the Japanese armed forces, not just Army and Navy, but also up and down the various ranks. So there is no one answer. Because, well, obviously I'm nowhere near as well versed in Japanese army history, but looking purely at the Japanese Navy, the younger crew and officers, the ones who'd been very much indoctrinated in the, military twisting of Bushido, the military dictatorship effectively that was going on in Japan in the late 20s and 30s, they almost to the very end were still kind of, we are superior, everybody else is soft and weak and will surrender at the drop of a hat. But as you went higher and higher up the chain, you had officers who had either spent a good chunk or perhaps most of their naval career not quite subjected to the weird military nationalist government that characterized interwar Japan, and some of them had even served relatively extensively either during the time of the Anglo-Japanese alliance or even alongside the Royal Navy. And so their views of the capabilities and will of the other Allied powers were significantly more moderated, albeit they didn't necessarily want to say that directly to the government, who, as I said, were made up of a bunch of frothing ethno-nationalists. So, you might have, even on the same ship, particularly on some of the larger ships like the battleships, a bunch of junior officers and crew who would see, let's say perhaps in the early part of the campaign in early 42, they would see Allied units and go, oh yes, well clearly we will triumph because they're all soft and weak and stupid. But at the same time, the commanders aboard and maybe the captain will be going, we have to play our cards carefully here, because although we believe that we are the better navy and we have the better ships, they're still, worthy opponents, which could mess us up if we're not careful. And obviously those views would chop and change as the war went on, so it would be somewhat forgivable, let's say, by April, early May 1942, for some of the more senior officers to have begun to buy into the whole we are absolutely better than them in every single way propaganda, because, well, up until that point, the Japanese campaign had seemed to indicate that they were. Whereas, by late 43, early 44, when Japan is very definitely on the back foot, some of those younger officers might be going, hang on a minute, maybe all of that indoctrination wasn't quite accurate. And the reason I mention the Anglo-Japanese alliance is because, of course, they would have different views on different nations that made up the Allies as well. So America was a little bit of an unknown, but culturally the Japanese had, and to a certain extent potentially in some areas still have, a bit of a chip on their shoulder about the whole, black ships, expeditions, etc. So they would perhaps be a little bit more pejorative about the US, who they'd never really seen as anything other than a threat, as compared to the British, who A, hadn't, wedged their ports open by threat of military force, and B, had in relatively recent times been a little bit friendlier towards them, albeit a lot of that goodwill was well expended by the Second World War. Baron von Faust asks, can you tell us about the misadventures of interwar Thornycroft export destroyer designs? Well, it depends, because there's three broad categories of that. There's Thornycroft export destroyers that they actually built and sold to other people. Then there's destroyers that Thornycroft designed, but the ships themselves were actually built elsewhere in foreign yards. And then there's the various designs that Thornycroft tried to get people to buy, but were unsuccessful in doing so. So I'm, in this question, going to cover the first of those, and if you meant one or the other of the other two categories, then obviously just let me know via messaging or something like that. Now, the three major build groups that Thornycroft actually built and exported in the interwar period were a series of destroyers for Chile, a series of destroyers for Brazil, and a couple of destroyers for the Canadians. So, starting with the earliest ones, the Serrano class were half a dozen destroyers, and essentially they were, if you imagine the then current British destroyers, so A, B, C, D class, just slightly miniaturized. And this is actually, roughly speaking, a design that Thornycroft tried to sell quite a few times to different people, miniaturized versions of British fleet destroyers. So they're only about 1,000 tons, maybe 1,100 tons if you're generous, standard displacement. And the main difference between them and regular British fleet destroyers was that whereas the regular British fleet destroyer would have 4 single 4.7-inch guns, these destroyers would only have 3 of them, 2 superfiring forward singles and 1 aft. And in the Serrano's case, they also had a 3-inch anti-aircraft gun, which was much lighter weight, but kind of roughly took the place of the 4th gun. And they had a pair of triple torpedo tubes, whereas British destroyers at this point tended to have quadruple torpedo tubes. And also, being somewhat smaller ships, you had to make a decision between whether you wanted them to be fitted for mine laying or mine sweeping. The Chileans operated for a 50-50 split in that capability. And they happily lasted until the late 50s and early 60s. Also, around the end of the 1920s, you have the Canadian ships, the Saguenay, I think, possibly, and the Skeena. And much like the Chilean vessels, they're also modified versions of British destroyers, and that's what you can see here. This is Saguenay, or however it's pronounced. And she is an A-class derivative. And compared to the standard A-class, they displaced just a fraction less. They were a couple of feet shorter, but they had the same kind of armament, along with a fractionally longer range, because the hull was built with additional strengthening to deal with ice, which is obviously a thing that Canadians have to deal with a lot more. The slight reduction in weight made them slightly more stable, which helped with potential build-up of ice up top. And if you look very closely, the Saguenay and Skeena, compared to a standard A-class, have very much more flared bows, again to help shoot water and ice away from them. And although their slight reductions overall meant they were slightly less powerful machinery-wise, they actually had about the same speed thanks to being slightly lighter ships. And then at the end of the 30s, you have half a dozen destroyers laid down for Brazil, and they are derivatives of the G-class, or H-class, depending on who you ask. And essentially the only real difference between the Brazilian ships and the Royal Navy ships is that, once again, the Royal Navy ships have 4 single 4.7-inch guns. The Brazilian ships had 3 single 4.7-inch guns, but significantly more depth charges, so very heavily oriented to the anti-submarine role. But they never actually got to enter Brazilian service because, being under construction at the end of the 1930s, they were requisitioned - bought off of the Brazilians and entered service with the Royal Navy, where they served through the Second World War. Farender Ritter asks, if the Kriegsmarine had the political power to do its pre-war Navy ambitions and have more U-boats and technology, could they have achieved their objectives with the U-boats for the war up to and into 1944, or were their strategic goals far too optimistic? Some of the Kriegsmarine's plans were a little bit too pie in the sky to ever be realistically achievable, but you have to remember that it's not just about political power, it's also about building capacity. Just because Hitler says, yes, Raeder, you can have as many ships as you like or as many U-boats as you like, which will obviously make Dönitz very happy, doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get them, because German industry may not be able to supply the steel, the diesel engine, power plants, etc., etc., etc. But even if they're able to achieve a substantial increase in U-boat production, The thing is that it's always very dangerous with this kind of what if they had this scenario, is that if you look at it in isolation and you say, okay, well, I'm going to grant Germany, I don't know, 50, 100 extra U-boats or something. Okay, then assessing it against what historically happened, you could say, well, this will have this additional effect. The problem is that's not how military procurement in history works. If the Germans had, cranked up the dial to 11 on U-boat production in the mid-1930s, which is realistically when they would have had to do it to have a substantially increased U-boat fleet by 39, well, everybody else is going to look at them and go, one, you're much more blatantly breaking the terms of the Anglo-German Naval Agreement far sooner than everybody historically realised that they were going to do, and two, as a result of that, not only, well, there might be some attempts to, punish Germany for it, but even if there aren't, everybody else is going to start cranking out anti-submarine countermeasures much, much faster and sooner. So rather than ordering the Flower class in 39, some version thereof might be ordered in 36, 37 or something like that. Or the U-class submarines who are being designed in the mid-1930s might well be successful in the push to have them designed as essentially R-class successors, i.e. small, fast, underwater hunter-killer subs, rather than small coastal training subs. And so the situation that Germany, with a lot more U-boats in 39 would face, would be radically different from the one that they faced historically. Yes, you have a lot more U-boats. Theoretically, you can do a lot more. But if the Allies are starting out with a lot more escorts and potentially a whole bunch of hunter-killers waiting offshore for you to come out, you may actually end up in a worse position. TST 1987 asks, I've always loved the underappreciated feature of certain early dreadnought battleships, the last holdovers from the early day of shooting cannon out the sides, the casemate gun. For various reasons already covered, casemate guns were already considered broadly obsolete by the end of World War I, but heading into World War II, various modernised ships, Warspite, Hood, Congos, many American standards, retained most or some of their casemate guns. So, were casemate guns on dreadnoughts ever actually effective in battle actions against enemy combatants in World War II? And were they ever hooked up to an integrated fire control system to be effective? Casemate guns, as you can see here on Warspite's refit, were occasionally used in World War II in battle on the refitted ships, just not very often. So obviously the US standard battleships didn't really end up in straight-up combat with other ships all that often, Surigao Strait aside. But the Japanese certainly made use of their secondary guns in Callahan's night action off Guadalcanal, and in a couple of other night actions where you have Congos involved. Warspite did make use of her secondaries at times against enemy ships as well. Obviously at Matapan, they had to be warned off from actually accidentally shooting Formidable with the offside 6 inches when she sheared out of line. But more broadly speaking, thanks to the way that battles tended to shake out in the Second World War, the most common use for casemate guns was either shore bombardment, or actually in a few occasions that the ships ended up in fights with other capital ships or cruisers, being used against them if the range was close enough. Simply put, for whatever reason, outside of a couple of night actions in the Pacific Theatre, there wasn't actually all that many opportunities where destroyers were closing in on capital ships to deliver torpedo attacks, outside of things like Scharnhorst and Bismarck, and both of those ships didn't have casemate batteries. Although, speaking of Warspite, she did use her 6 inches against enemy destroyers at Narvik. Michael William Jane asks, I love listening to the Drydock while I'm closing out the night. There was a question in Drydock episode 341 part 1 about a grandson wanting to know about his grandfather who ran the ship's stores. While you were explaining what his job was, you said part of what he was doing was taking care of the ship's beer stores. I thought you were talking about a US Navy ship, but then I thought you were talking about a British ship. I did get a bit confused. So it was a US Navy ship, and actually this question allows me to address a few different points. So yes, the US Navy is officially dry in 1945. However, there are a few variations and exceptions to this. Firstly, you could have beer ashore, just not on the ship, or alcohol generally. But of course, in the Pacific, on these little Pacific islands, there isn't a native beer-making facility, and therefore, in order for the crew to have the morale-raising effect of being able to consume beer or other alcohols, the ship is going to have to transport its own alcohol. Now, obviously, yes, supply ships could bring in large amounts of beer, but it's not necessarily guaranteed that the supply ship will get there in time, or if it's been a couple of weeks earlier, that another ship's crew hasn't drunk the place dry. So, naturally, there is, of course, a pressing need for US Navy warships to carry their own supply of beer for when they get ashore. Honestly, Governor. Also, there were very limited medical exceptions where you might have permission to serve alcohol within the rules and regulations. So, for example, if somebody needs it medically, or perhaps sort of medically, if you've been in combat, someone's been blown over the side of the ship by an explosion, hauled back on board, it was generally accepted that maybe that person needed a bit of a stiff drink to settle their nerves. And of course, if you're going to do that, you need a supply of alcohol on board. So there are plenty of reasons why a US Navy ship would be carrying beer aboard, even though technically the US Navy is dry, in the Second World War. The other thing is that, at least in the more distant stations and, ships where perhaps accountability to senior command was a little bit lower, the idea that the ship was dry really became in paper only. So a lot of submarines were notable for carrying significant supplies of beer, which would be issued while they were on patrol, but it would be issued for things like surviving a significant depth charge attack or sinking an enemy ship. And then that brings me on to the other thing that this gives me the opportunity to talk about, which is the USS Chanticleer, which, if you watch the Operation Jaywick video with the MV Crate, you'll know, well, I said that, one, she was acting as a submarine tender at the time, and two, that she served alcohol to the Intrepid Commando crew. And some people were saying, well, one, she wouldn't have served alcohol at all, and because US Navy ship therefore dry, and two, the Chanticleer is actually a repair ship, not a submarine tender. And to that I would say, well, one, Chanticleer was docked up in an Australian port. The chances of the crew actually obeying honestly, the US Navy ship should be dry when she's one of the very, very few US Navy vessels in the area, and you're literally moored up in an Australian port. Yeah, those ships aren't going to be dry. Sorry. Especially considering that she's serving submarines, who, as we've just mentioned, are the other type of ship in the US Navy, or boat, I suppose, who are definitely not going to be dry. I mean, you could technically, I suspect the captain will go, well, technically, we're moored up, not permanently, but for a very extended period of time here. I'm going to officially count us as ashore, even if we're on our ship. The other thing, of course, is, yes, Chanticleer in her later career was a repair ship, but if you actually look at her service career, in the very first part of her career, once she's built, because she's built, pretty much during the Second World War, right at the start, her very first deployment is in fact to Australia, where she acts as a submarine tender for an extended period of time. So and that's actually her first assignment. So during the time that the MV Crate shows up and Operation Jaywick is underway, it is entirely accurate to call Chanticleer a submarine tender, because that's what she's doing, and she hasn't actually done anything else before in her career, even though later on she would be a different kind of vessel or act in a different kind of role. John McCarthy asks, in a recent dry dock, you mentioned you were fascinated by certain aspects of the sinking of HMS Victoria. Would you be willing to share a few of the most fascinating bits? Well, there's a lot of fascinating elements to the sinking of Victoria. I mean, from a human perspective, just the fact, it seems fairly clear to me at least, that Tryon was trying to get his fleet to think for themselves, and then you watch the abject lack of thinking for themselves gradually unfold. Then you have the kind of the what-ifs of history, because Jellicoe was aboard the Victoria not that far from where Camperdown hit her. So any number of circumstances, if he'd been in a slightly different place, if Camperdown had hit Victoria in a slightly different place, if Jellicoe had been a little bit slower in getting up and out of the ship, the Grand Fleet could have been without its commander for the Battle of Jutland. Someone else would have been in charge. Who would have been in charge? Would they have done as good a job? Who knows? Then you've got the fact that, well, as you can see her sinking here, as she goes down, she ends up lawn darting into the seabed and becomes a vertical shipwreck, which is an exceptionally rare thing. And as far as I'm aware, Victoria is the only full warship that has done this and has remained upright. Now, yes, there is a Russian wreck in the Baltic that has done a similar thing, but as far as I'm aware, it's a monitor, so it doesn't really count in my head as a full-scale warship. And not only that, of course, is that Victoria is well over a century. I mean, well over 120 years down there, and she's still vertical, which is a bit of a testament to the strength of her hull, even if the bow's a little bit pancaked. And of course, you have the whole actual ramming section, which shows that technically, if you could get a ram off, it would work in fatally damaging a ship. Although, another fascinating about it, of course, is that the ram actually forms a perfect plug. So, bizarrely, as long as Camperdown and Victoria had remained wedged together, Victoria wouldn't, have been at risk of sinking. I mean, obviously, eventually you would have to pull Camperdown out, and there then would have been a fairly significant risk of sinking. But, in theory, if they'd kept Camperdown lodged in Victoria, it would have given the crew a lot more time to erect temporary bulkheads and such to try and minimise the flooding, whereas Camperdown reversing out actually opens up a massive great hole where the ram had been, which is what directly causes the ship to sink. The Wind Thief asks, can you give a rough breakdown of the various costs of building a warship during the 1930s? Yes, obviously if you want exactly how much it costs for every bit of armour, every gun, etc., that's a much more involved breakdown. But I have my handy copy of the 1937 Navy estimates, and there are two complete cruisers, handily both of the same class, Town class. One has been built in Royal Navy dockyards, that's the Birmingham, so one of the towns, and then the other one, I'll just make sure I get it right, go through to, because there's a lot of dockyard built ships, and then go to contract, there you go, contract built ships. So that's all battleships, that's actually Belfast and Edinburgh under construction. So the cruiser Glasgow had just finished construction as a contract-built ship as well. So you can get a direct estimate of where the costs go, not just between various elements as listed by the Navy, but also where they split up in Royal Dockyard ships versus contract-built ships. So I shall read to you from said estimates. So the total costs listed, it says total estimated cost of the ship as revised, including guns and aircraft, for the Birmingham is £1,889,197, and it specifically notes this includes £63,000 for the guns and £55,700 for the aircraft. The other costs are split as follows. Labour in the dockyard, £276,000. Materials in the dockyard, £226,000. Contract work for the hull, £153,582. Contract work for the machinery, £473,988. Contract work for the gun mountings, as opposed to the guns, £449,481. And then on costs and services, £191,446, leading to a total direct charge cost plus on costs of £1,770,497, to which you add the £63,000 for the guns and £55,700 for the aircraft. So you flip that over to the Glasgow, contract built, private yard. For dockyard work, obviously this is a lot lower, so dockyard work, as in Royal Dockyard work, labour £7,400, £71,300 for materials, but £825,984 for the hull, £442,496 for the machinery, £449,121 for the gun mountings, on costs of £12,638, leading to a total cost of £1,808,939, plus £63,000 for the guns, £55,700 for the aircraft, leading to a total estimated cost for the ship of £1,927,639. Christopher Dooley asks, how were small arms and other bladed weapons issued to the Royal Navy or other naval sailors during the Age of Sail? Who was responsible for cleaning, maintenance and safe storage of a ship's small arms? And were personally owned arms common? Generally speaking, most commissioned officers would have their own weapons, definitely their own swords, and although they could draw on the ship's supply of firearms and other melee weapons, generally speaking, officers would tend to prefer their own custom weapons, i.e. ones that they'd bought personally. You could rely on them a bit more, apart from anything else. The regular crew would generally have their own personally owned small weapons, so daggers, knives, that kind of thing, because that would also be day-to-day equipment that they would use. But when it came to things like pikes, axes, and cutlasses, those would be stored aboard the ship, and normally, at least in the bulk of the Age of Sail, there wasn't any specific allocation like, oh, that's my cutlass, that's my pike. They would just be initially held centrally and then in preparation for battle distributed in job lots around the ship at various points where people could grab them as and when they needed them. On larger vessels, the maintenance of the weapons would be handled by a ship's armourer, and on big vessels like first rates, perhaps even an armourer's mate or armourer's mates. As you went down the line, the armourer's mates would go away, you just have the ship's armour, and as you went right down into the realm of medium to small size frigates, you wouldn't have a permanent armourer, you might have a shared role, so perhaps the ship's chief gunner would have the armourer role as a secondary role. Also, of course, the Royal Marines would be maintaining their own weapons, so some of the Marines, or one or two of them, might be pitched in on a smaller ship to help maintain the ship's issued weapons, because of course they would have the necessary expertise. For the general crew, having a personally owned sword or pistol was not really all that common for most of the Age of Sail, but it could still happen, either if you'd made some prize money and decided you wanted your own particular cutlass, or if you'd just taken something from the enemy ship. But broadly speaking, your day-to-day duties would actually be impeded by you walking around with swords or firearms strapped to you. So if you did have a personally owned weapon, it would normally be kept with your sea chest or in your hammock. So it may not be of all that much use to you, because if the ship needs to clear for action quickly, you might have not have a chance of getting hold of it. But you might also if you had a bit more notice. Rob Smith asks, I was thinking, having read about the Montgolfier brothers and their successors, why not convert the Great Eastern to a hot air balloon carrier? Naturally, some re-engineering would be needed, probably removing a bunch of the masts and trunking, and the funnels possibly. But would it work, and what use would such a conversion be? In theory, there's more than enough volume aboard the Great Eastern to pull off a hot air balloon conversion. I mean, you perhaps maybe ditch the two aftmost masts and set up a little launch platform there, and the area below as a hold to hold the balloon itself, etc., when it's not being used. However, there isn't actually all that much legitimate use for hot air balloons in a naval context, especially in the period when they're initially being invented in the 19th century, because fundamentally hot air balloons are at the mercy of the wind. Now, these days, hot air balloons can maneuver to a certain extent, but that's only thanks to extremely detailed weather forecasting that tells us what the wind currents are at different altitudes. So, if you're on the ground and your windsock says, well, the wind is going south, and, well, your balloon is going south. But if you've got access to the modern weather forecasting facilities, you can look at your phone or a printout prediction or something and go, oh, okay, well, down here it's going south, but at 2,000 feet it's going west, and 4,000 feet it's going north, or something like that. So if you do want to go north, then you know you have to take yourself up to 4,000 feet. You'll be swept that way. And then if you want to come back, then you have to lower yourself down and you'll be swept back towards where you launched. Of course, they don't have this kind of information in the 19th century, so they wouldn't know where the winds above, the obvious at ground level are actually going. I mean, they might know if they looked up at the clouds, if the clouds were going in a different direction to where the wind was blowing at ground level or at sea level, but there's an awful lot of in-between space where the winds might be doing something completely different, and that's assuming there even are clouds. But even assuming that you do launch a hot air balloon, well, if the wind is blowing somewhere that's not in the direction of the enemy that you want to scout, well, then you're going the wrong way, and there's not really an easy way for anyone to collect you other than going back to find you. Whereas if you are being blown in the direction of your opponent, well, great, now you can do some scouting. But one, in the 19th century, how the heck do you tell anyone about this? Because you can't fly back to them because the wind's taking you that way. You can't radio them because radio equipment doesn't really become a thing until the very, very end of the 19th century. You could, in theory, try flags, flares, or potentially signal lamps, but good luck with that, especially considering that, well, if you're over the enemy itself, you could have some problems because they can then potentially read what you're saying unless you do it in an encrypted manner. And then having done your due diligence and scouting, well, you're now being swept past the enemy. So how are they going to get you back? Hope for the wind to change, or ascend and take pot luck that you might be blown back the way you came. This is basically why a lot of the sort of alternate history fictions were like, oh yes, well, we're using hot air balloons to spot the enemy. That immediately tells me someone hasn't actually thought their fiction through, because it just flat out wouldn't work without some method of wind-independent propulsion. And good luck with that, because, well, internal combustion engines are also a very late 19th century thing, and I'd love to see someone try and get a mid-19th century hot air balloon with a full steam plant up into the air. That would be amusing, apart from anything else. About the only real use you could potentially have would be for a, relatively speaking, small hot air balloon, at which point you definitely do want to retain at least some of the masts, because you could use it as a tethered scouting device, basically just to increase the height of your spotting. Similar to a kite balloon or just a straight up kite, although I suppose a hot air balloon would be maybe a little bit more stable and could stay up for longer. But at that point, you're essentially just a glorified high altitude spotter. And in that context, well, maybe there's a small amount of utility to that, but converting something the size of the Great Eastern just for that, I think is less practical. You could do that kind of conversion on a much smaller ship and use a much smaller area to do so. Andre de Coult asks, please tell us more about the 3 survivors from HMS Hood. How did they survive the initial sinking? Were they the only ones to make it off the ship alive, or were they the only ones who were rescued? And who rescued them, when and how? How long after the sinking were they picked up? And can you briefly summarise their careers? So, the 3 survivors were Bob Tilburn, Bill Dundas, and Ted Briggs. And of the 3, we only have detailed accounts from 2 of them, because Bill Dundas, as far as I'm aware, never actually shared what happened to him that day with anyone. But from what we do know is that all 3 of them were positioned in different parts of the ship, but of the 2 who did give us accounts, that being Ted and Bob, they both described being taken down with the ship. And certainly Ted Briggs mentioned there were other people in the water as well initially, but as the ship went down, the suction of the ship sinking, so that being such a large ship and sinking so quickly, basically took everyone and everything down with it. As far as Bob Tilburn is concerned, he was caught up on part of the ship's wreckage. He cut himself free and then found himself shooting up to the surface at incredibly high speed. Ted Briggs was just sucked down and thought that was it, but then got propelled back up to the surface at incredibly high speed. And as I said, we don't know what happened with Bill Dundas, but probably something very similar. The conjecture, certainly that on the part of Ted Briggs, was that something below collapsed, either a further explosion, boiler collapse, maybe a large compartment and a big air bubble escaping, boiler explosion, something like that. And this upwelling is what propelled them to the surface, because they all seem, despite all having left the ship at different points along the ship, they all popped up in a relatively close proximity to each other, and then eventually gathered all on a Carly float or a biscuit raft. It depends on exactly the account. But they were all together. Bill Dundas kept everybody awake by singing songs. And then eventually, after about 3 hours, the destroyer HMS Electra, which had been one of the escort destroyers for Hood and Prince of Wales, but had been left behind because it wasn't able to keep up during the day in the rough weather, showed up and took them aboard. They were then disembarked in Iceland and taken home. All three remained in the Navy. The shortest career of the three was Bob Tilburn. He spent some time ashore after Hood was sunk, but then went back essentially mostly to work on battleships. So he went back on Queen Elizabeth. He was part of the Eastern Fleet in the latter part of the war. He then spent a short period of time working with small craft, air-sea rescue boats, then a minesweeper, but then he went back aboard HMS Howe, the battleship in the post-war environment. Then he went on the aircraft carrier HMS Warrior for the Korean War, and then he left the Royal Navy in August 1952. Bill Dundas had a variety of postings after Hood sank. He was on the cruiser HMS Neptune in the Mediterranean and the destroyer HMS Kingston in the Mediterranean, and then the battleship HMS Queen Elizabeth in the Mediterranean. He then transferred, for reasons best known to himself, to the submarine arm aboard Porpoise and then Telemachus, both out in the Eastern Fleet and in the Pacific. And then post-war, he stayed with submarines for most of the 1940s. Then he was also, ironically enough, aboard HMS Warrior in the Korean War, and then a variety of various postings until he retired in 1958. Ted Briggs, meanwhile, had the longest career. He went on to spend most of his career, both wartime and post-war, in various auxiliary ships and training vessels, and he was actually present at both the Salerno landings and the Normandy landings. He was briefly back aboard a frontline warship in the Korean War, aboard HMS Ceylon, and then back to various training vessels, including some carriers that were being used as training ships. But he actually only left the Navy in the early 1970s, believe it or not. So, believe it or not, there are actually a number of people who are still around and still quite healthy and hopefully have a decent amount of their lives ahead of them, who have served in the Royal Navy, probably retired by now, in fact almost certainly retired by now, but certainly have served in the Royal Navy at a point where in their early days as midshipmen, they may well have been trained by Ted Briggs, a guy who was aboard HMS Hood when it went down, which means there is actually only 1 or 2 degrees of separation between the men in the Royal Navy now and the men serving aboard Hood. And he was also the last to pass away, only passing away in 2008 at the age of 85. Dennis Kocher asks, exactly how obsolete were the ships that Lord Fisher scrapped when he became First Sea Lord, and what do you think was the most obsolete example? Well, most of them were very obsolete. I mean, HMS Warrior, a few years before Fisher came in, was still being optimistically classed as a first-class armoured cruiser, having been derated from a third-class battleship, and she was the very first ironclad in Royal Navy service. I mean, I love Warrior, I do, but 4.5 inches of iron armour, mid-teens of knots, and a bunch of random shell guns from the 1870s is not in any way, shape or form going to be competing with a Drake class or a Duke of Edinburgh class. It's just not a thing. Now, to be fair, Warrior had been taken out of active reserve status, as say in 1900, but a great many of her immediate successors, the ironclads of the mid to late 1860s, were still in the reserve fleet, theoretically available for war purposes. And it's not just those, because if you go forward, you got, Devastation, the previous dreadnought, and even going through to things like the Benbow class and the Sandbags, Victoria's sister ship, the immediately before pre-dreadnought ships. Even those were hopelessly obsolete because they were, by and large, slower than even a pre-dreadnought, let alone what was to come. And their guns didn't have the elevation or the barrel length to match the range of the new guns aboard most of the pre-dreadnoughts. So even if you've taken it to your head that you're going to stick modern fire control on a late 1870s, early 1880s ironclad, it's just going to be horrifically outranged, outsped, and out-armoured by any capital ship around. And yeah, okay, maybe some of the later ones, like the Admiral class and Sandbags left on her own, might be able to win a gunfight with a cruiser. But once again, most of the bigger armoured cruisers could almost certainly outrange them and outspeed them by a relatively hilarious amount. So, yeah, they were very, very obsolete. And this is even before Fisher gets Dreadnought built. And in terms of the most obsolete, well, yeah, pick any number of 1860s era broadside ironclads. Stafford Magnus asks, "Good day, Drac. I noticed many British battleships have one portside anchor and two starboard anchors. Why is this layout so common? Also, it seems many World War I era British battleships had a stern anchor, but these seem to disappear by World War II. And why was this?" Generally, the double starboard anchor has two primary roles. Firstly, it's a spare. Just in case you lose an anchor, you have to carry a spare somewhere. And, well, if you're going to store it one place or another, why not store it on the starboard side? But there is a far more compelling reason why you would have it on the starboard side. And that is, where do you most commonly use a ship's anchor? Now, you might anchor with both your port and starboard anchors. You might anchor with just the one. But, clues in the name. Old school style, port, your left-hand side, is the side that you, go up to your port with. The starboard side, or steerboard, where the steering wheel used to be, that's the side that usually faces outwards. So generally speaking, your starboard anchor is going to see more use. Therefore, if in case you lose it, it's the one that's most likely to need replacement. Plus, if you are most commonly anchoring with your starboard anchor, that means that if you're anchoring in rough weather, then you might need a second anchor on that side to help lock you in place and potentially also have them spread out to help keep you in place even more so against both currents and winds. You can see here this is HMS Agamemnon docked up on the port side with her starboard side facing out, and you can see here she has her two anchors on the starboard side. But with that said, a lot of the second starboard anchors weren't actually all chained up and ready to go. They were just suspended there, maybe with a brief length of chain to make sure they didn't go AWOL. So if you were having to anchor against really rough weather, you'd usually use your starboard and port anchors. Now, in terms of stern anchors, they can be somewhat useful because obviously if you drop one or both of your bow anchors and your stern anchor, then you really are locked in place. You're not going to go swinging around on your anchor chains. However, they're relatively rare because they're really only used for emergencies. The problem is that if you have a stern anchor, you might think, well, as we just said, it might make you more stable. But as a ship moves on its mooring, if the anchor chain therefore goes slack and scrapes against the hull, on the bow, at worst, that's some scraped paint, not a major problem. At the stern, there's a relatively high chance that that anchor may either damage or get wrapped up in the rudders or the propellers and the propeller shafts, which is obviously very bad, and it might just damage them by scraping them as well. So a stern anchor really is not a particularly favoured thing. As I said, you would only use it in absolute emergencies, or if you were making sure the ship was getting ready for an absolutely massive storm, at which point you try and make sure the stern anchor is as far away from your ship as possible, so the chain would be paid out quite diagonally. But for those very, very limited circumstances, when you've got other things you can have in the stern, it's usually not worth it, so not usually seen in most ships. PH5817 asks, John Partial mentions that on some carriers the Japanese Navy reinforced the cofferdams around the aviation gasoline tanks by filling them with concrete. With the concrete used as a spacer between the decapping layer and the armour plate by the Italians, are there other examples of cement-based materials used in combat vessels? There were a few other examples of carriers encapsulating their aviation gasoline tanks with concrete or cement, but either, as part of the design or as a post-build modification, as well as the Japanese Navy doing it. But in terms of combat vessels, the only other two significant uses of concrete or cement that I'm aware of is that there was some consideration, and on very small ships and or merchant ships, some attempted implementation of the use of concrete as a form of quick and easy to apply armour. Obviously, it's not going to withstand much in terms of incoming heavy shells, but it was considered and trialled as an alternative to the plastic armour and tarmac armour that was installed again on some smaller ships to stop bullets and maybe the odd 20mm cannon shell. The other much more widespread use of concrete in combat vessels was as a temporary patch for damage control, not necessarily while the ship is at sea and trying to salvage itself after having been hit, but when the ship pulls into port and needs repairs, straightening out and working out all the wreckage, cutting it free, etc., etc. Yes, you would want to do that, but in combat conditions, your port that you're in might not have the facilities to do that, and your ship might not have the time. It might be needed back on the front line much, much sooner than that kind of extensive work would need. And so very often you would have concrete poured into the damaged compartments, perhaps with a forming or shaping plate on the outside, and the concrete would just be used as a giant waterproof plug, and then the ship could get on its way. Lots of ships had this done, so Warspite was carrying a fair bit of concrete on board by the end, and even the USS North Carolina, she had concrete put in to help plug up the damage caused by the torpedo strike in the early part of the war, and a significant chunk of that was still there when they did maintenance work around the bow a few years ago. So you can actually buy bits of genuine World War II damage control concrete from USS North Carolina. Peter Dasso asks, which of the various camouflage schemes tested on ships in the 20th century were found to be the most effective and which were complete failures? And after World War II, why was the consensus just paint everything grey? There was no one most effective camouflage scheme, unfortunately, simply because there were multiple types of threat. You could be spotted by and shot at by submarines, you could be spotted and shot at by surface ships, and spotted and shot at by, or have bombs dropped on you and torpedoes, by aircraft. And each of those threat scenarios, and that's being very broad because obviously there are subsections of each of those threat scenarios, but just those three as a broad category required different kinds of camouflage. I mean, ideally, camouflage you want to try and not be seen, because a ship that is not seen cannot be shot at. However, once you are seen, then a monolithic camouflage scheme just renders you somewhat easy to target, because it fairly clearly outlines your vessel. Whereas you get various dazzle schemes, like you can see on USS Essex here, and they perhaps make it slightly easier to spot your ship in the first place, but they might give a deceptive idea about what your ship is doing. So that might then confuse your opponent into shooting in the wrong direction. Not as in 180 degrees in the opposite direction, but perhaps thinking you're bigger or smaller than you are, or you're going in a different direction or at a different speed than what you actually are. And you can actually see this somewhat in effect in this picture, because if you look very carefully at the bow, which is on the left, you'll see that you've got the, relatively speaking, vertical stem of an Essex class. It's not entirely, it's raked forward somewhat, But that has been painted in white, sort of quarter circle white. But if you were just glancing at this picture briefly, or perhaps looking at it on your phone, you might think that the curve of the bow is actually that black curve, or maybe the grey curve cast by the shadow. Now, that would give you a false idea of the length of the ship, therefore potentially the type of the ship. It might also, depending on where the bow wave is, give you a false idea of the speed of the ship, because remember, you can estimate the speed of a vessel if you're looking at its bow wave and subsequent trough. But if you think the bow's in a different position, you're going to measure the position of the troughs differently, or the peaks, which means you're going to get an inaccurate idea of speed. And various other things. And you've got false bow waves to also give a false idea that perhaps you're going faster than you actually are, and so on and so forth. And if the sunlight was perhaps at a lower angle behind the camera in this view, then you can see there's also this light patch on the stern, which might end up perhaps also washing out. So you might end up with the idea that you're looking at a very much smaller carrier. Obviously, in this particular circumstance with the light, it's fairly obvious where the stern is anyway. And debate and argument raged over what was better, to misdirect a certain number of attacks, but then not have much effect against the ones that did make it, or to perhaps be attacked at the same amount, or perhaps even more if you were a bit more noticeable, but to misdirect a high percentage of those attacks by some form of defensive and deceptive camouflage. And this is why you see everybody changing round constantly with their various camouflage schemes. And hence, there is no one most effective scheme, because there might be a really effective scheme against air attack that doesn't really help you against subs, one that's really good against subs that doesn't really help you against air or surface attack, and so on and so forth. The consensus on grey towards the end seems to be mostly because grey is not particularly brilliant at any one of these attack methods, but it is somewhat effective against all of them, and also it's relatively cheap and easy to do. And of course, depending on the sea conditions where the ships operate the most commonly, everybody has their own idea of what exact shade of grey they should be using. So grey blends in relatively well in darkness, it blends in very well in poor weather conditions, and it blends in okay, surprisingly enough, even in really bright conditions. Not brilliantly, but better than some. And so, for example, back in the very start of the 20th century, the Royal Navy actually experimented with a pale green colour, believe it or not, and they actually found that in most circumstances, pale green was actually really effective at hiding ships. We're talking about a very pale pastel green. It was very, very effective at hiding ships, except in poor weather where you had a dark background, like dark storm clouds, and then suddenly the ship popped out like, almost better than if you lit it up with artificial spotlights. So they didn't go with that in the end, luckily. Jim Latos asks, why wasn't USS Lexington used instead of Hornet for the Doolittle Raid? Her longer flight deck and higher top speed would presumably have allowed for more B-25s and or heavier payloads, or at least a greater safety margin for the same strike capacity. Essentially, it came down to where the carriers were at the time the Doolittle operation was conceived. Lexington was putting the work in on the front lines in the Western Pacific and wasn't going to come any closer to the continental US than Pearl Harbor before it was eventually obviously lost at Coral Sea. Whereas Hornet was, at the time the Doolittle Raid was conceived, still fitting out on the East Coast in Norfolk. So they could actively test whether, if you wanted to test, can a B-25 actually operate from an aircraft carrier? Well, Hornet was the carrier that was there that could be tested on. And once you've configured your testing regime for a Yorktown-class carrier, then you're going to want to keep it that way. And then, of course, the other factor was, as Hornet finished her working up trials and made her way around the US to head out to the Pacific, it meant that she would be calling by in California, which meant that the B-25s, once they'd completed their on-land training, could fly over to California and be craned aboard Hornet and taken out to sea. And therefore, well, once they're on board, you might as well use them on the ship that they've trained to operate aboard. Whereas for Lexington to be used, it would either have meant having to call Lexington back from operational service from at least Pearl Harbor all the way across the Eastern Pacific to pick up the B-25s and then go all the way back again, which would be inefficient and leave the US without a vital carrier on the front line, because of course Hornet would still be en route regardless. And there was the other factor, which was that as relatively new as the war was, Lexington's air group at least had some measure of combat experience, and so again they were much more valuable on the front lines conducting operations, as opposed to Hornet's air group, which, while she did carry it with her when she went off to conduct the Doolittle Raid, ultimately being a brand new air group on a brand new carrier, didn't really have all that much in the way of combat experience aboard. Mon Squire asks, Admiral Sackville Hamilton Carden, was he the best the Royal Navy could initially muster to be in charge at Gallipoli? He was the Malta Dockyard Superintendent, an admiral that had spent several years on half pay. His career appears to be one of basic competence, but nothing to lead one to think that he was a theatre commander material. How did he get first pick? Why not just go straight to Admiral de Roebuck? Was Carden's plan good against the Turks at first because they were caught unawares? And what were the causes of its later failure? Did de Roebuck scrap, modify or keep Carden's plan? And how common was placing admirals on half pay in the 20th century? Well, the initial reason that Carden got the job was because at the time they came up with the idea of attacking the Dardanelles, he was in command of the Eastern Mediterranean Squadron, so he was the senior officer on scene, so therefore he should be the one to come up with the ideas, at least as far as Royal Navy tradition went. In terms of being on half pay, it wasn't massively common, but in the early 20th century, and indeed in the late 19th century, the idea of being promoted to Rear Admiral but then spending a short time on half pay wasn't entirely unheard of, because by merit or seniority you might have gotten your promotion to Rear Admiral, but there might not be any Rear Admiral commands immediately available. So the only solution at that point is to then go on half pay until one becomes open. Now, for all that the Turks were very much forewarned that the Royal Navy was coming, Carden's plan initially was actually quite good. It was going quite well. And then you have him falling ill, which then coincides with de Roebuck taking command, and then the big disaster that means they kind of stop trying to force the Straits. Now, it wasn't that Carden's plan was going absolutely without fault, because, you know, there were some frustrations. Some of the upgraded defences were proving very hard to crack, but by and large, the Turkish defences were being suppressed and were in a state of collapse at the time that Carden left the operation. However, the more and more I look, I actually went and cross-checked a number of dates for this question. I've made mention several times in various video formats, including on the Drydock, about the frustration of Admiral Cunningham, or well, to-be Admiral Cunningham's, at the time much lower ranked junior officer Cunningham's, destroyers being fitted for minesweeping and then not being called on, and instead the trawlers being called on, and to a certain extent that decision was largely responsible for the debacle that was getting 3 pre-dreadnoughts sunk. I'm beginning to suspect more and more that the fitting of minesweeping gear to those destroyers was ordered by Carden as an element of his revised plan to make one final push through the Straits, and that in the middle of his health breakdown and de Roebuck taking over, someone somewhere didn't pass that information over to de Roebuck, which left him to use the trawlers, because he appears to have not known about the destroyers at all. And it may actually be that change of command, therefore, and the confusion surrounding it that actually is ultimately the cause of the problem, because if Carden's health had remained intact for a few weeks longer, assuming that I'm right in my deductions, then for the next big push he would have gone, right, well, this last-minute fitting of destroyers with minesweeping gear that I ordered a week or two ago, right, I want you up there front and centre, and who knows if that big push that went ahead doesn't result in the loss of multiple pre-dreadnoughts and the damaging of a battlecruiser, and instead the mines are swept and the fleet presses onwards, who knows what could have happened then. Greg M. asks, in Drydock 343 there was a question about the various combinations of more guns of lower caliber versus fewer larger caliber guns. Considering the period beginning with HMS Dreadnought, when and why did any of the major navies decide to opt for more smaller guns on their heavy cruisers and above, with your choice of definition for heavy cruiser? The decision point basically arises with the death of the armoured cruiser, because the advent of the battle cruiser rather obsoletes the armoured cruiser, and the armoured cruiser is the one that's been getting really, really big guns, 8.3 inch, 9.2 inch, 10 inch in the US Navy's case, and so forth. Now, with that ship kind of going away, you will gradually have what had initially been termed the light armoured cruiser or the light cruiser, which is slightly different terminology to the London Naval Treaty light cruiser, coming up in the world. So you previously had your armoured cruisers and your protected cruisers, and your protected cruisers had generally had 4 or 4.1 inch guns and maybe a few 5.9 or 6 or 6.1 inch guns. But as you get into the true light armoured cruiser, i.e. things like the Royal Navy's World War I Town class and then the Sea class, 2 of which you can see here on the left, they started to have more 6-inch guns and then a uniform battery of 6-inch guns. And then as those cruisers grew still further, you got the D&E class, which just had more 6-inch guns. But then you had the Hawkins class, of which you can see one on the right. And yeah, they very much do look like someone just, went copy, paste, scale, multiply by, 1.7 and that's how you get a Hawkins. But the Hawkins class are essentially some of the first cruisers to be built with guns whose caliber was substantially above 6 inches, which, as I said, had previously been the accepted maximum general armament for most protected cruisers. And, of course, it's being built under a new paradigm, primarily to hunt down other cruisers at high speed, as opposed to outlast them in an armoured gunfight, although, of course, the Hawkins class do have some armour. And they've got their 7.5-inch weapons. And at that point, this is when the Royal Navy is making a choice of, they could have built a ship with fewer 9.2-inch guns, because they still had plenty of those lying around and could have built more, but they chose to go with the lighter and, in theory, faster-firing weapons. And then, of course, shortly after that, the Washington Naval Treaty comes along and hard limits you to 8-inch guns anyway, so, you might as well use 8-inch guns, even if they are smaller than the 8.3, 9.2, and 10-inch weapons that the previous big cruisers had had. Brucey Antica asks, money, or lack thereof, seems to be the perennial grim reaper of the good idea fairy, regardless of the time or place being discussed. Can you describe some interesting material or equipment or fittings, things like exotic rare woods on Age of Sail ships, or experimental or unusual metallurgy during World War II, rather than whole weapon systems or entire ships, that were never taken on board or tested or applied on a wide scale because of cost? There's a whole range of stuff that falls into this category. So, yeah, there are various woods, for example, that were found in the Age of Sail to perhaps be notionally better than standard oak, but they would be perhaps either very rare or very difficult to get hold of, or potentially the main sources might be in enemy-held territory, or even if they weren't, a significant enemy-held territory might be between them and your source, all of which obviously complicates risk as well as cost. But you also have things like, for most instances, single timber masts are better than composite masts made up of many smaller timbers bound together. However, single timber masts were a bit difficult to get hold of at times, especially during conflict in the Age of Sail, and somewhat more expensive than composite masts, because obviously big single tree timber suitable for a mast is a lot rarer than a whole bunch of smaller, thinner bits of material that can be all slapped together. And so, although single timber masts were preferred in peacetime when you could carefully select, in wartime you very quickly saw composite masts coming along, and in the late 18th century that basically meant composite masts came along pretty much all the time because someone was always at war with somebody. Another system which fell afoul of all of this is actually simple constructional steel. Now, obviously much is made of the US using SDS steel through much of its construction, as well as obviously then its actual armour, the Class A and the Class B plate, because of the additional toughness of STS steel, which made the ship somewhat tougher to withstand damage and so forth. Now, the thing was, STS steel in and of itself wasn't some particularly unique special blend of steel that only the US had access to. As I said before, it's, a couple of points off of actual Class B. It's close enough to be used as armour. In some cases, it's not exactly the same, otherwise it would just be Class B armour. But a number of other nations had similar steels, like the British had Doolittle steel, which was very close to STS. But they didn't necessarily have as much money to throw at the situation, or necessarily as many plants producing that amount of Doolittle steel, and therefore, although Doolittle steel was used in the construction of British warships in reasonable amounts, it wasn't used anywhere quite as lavishly as the Americans used STS. And when you're looking at this picture, there's a reason I chose this, because obviously this shows Wildcat being taken to Enterprise's elevator. And quite a number of carriers in all the major carrier navies faced issues as time went on, not just due to the size and weight of aircraft increasing and that making it more difficult to get them to take off on the flight deck, but also because the size and the weight of the aircraft was making it harder and harder to fit them on the elevators, because the elevators had been designed to a specific size and a specific lifting weight that was contemporaneous with usually whatever the current generation of aircraft was, plus a little bit of a margin. But if you build a carrier like Enterprise in, the mid-30s, which is when the design is locked in, well, by the mid-40s, you've gone through 3, 4, 5 generations of attack aircraft, depending on when you start counting. And so the latest attack aircraft are going to be a lot larger and a lot heavier, and potentially have outgrown the margin of error that was built into your elevators in the first place. I'm not saying specifically Enterprise suffered that problem massively, but she's one of several ships of that period who would all suffer that problem to one degree or another. And the thing is, that's not to say there weren't larger, more powerful and faster moving lifts available at the time, but they would have cost a lot more money, and therefore people selected ones that were good enough rather than, the Rolls-Royce gold-plated version. Another example might be British oxygen-enriched torpedoes, because of course, while Japan would be famous in World War II for using oxygen-fueled torpedoes, the British actually were ahead of everybody else by the end of World War I, and they were the first to develop oxygen enrichment for their torpedoes, with obviously famously the 24.5-inch really big torpedoes they stuck on the Nelson class, but also the latest generation of torpedoes that they fitted on the County class at the time. However, what happened was they found, well, the oxygen enrichment system and also the sheer size of the Nelson's torpedoes made things a little bit cumbersome and a bit more difficult to work than with previous compressed air torpedoes, obviously compressed air with fuel. And so they decided, okay, we could develop this to work out all the kinks and the problems. But by the time they were making that decision, you were already looking at, well, first, a significant drawdown in naval funding, thanks to first the end of World War I and then the Washington Naval Treaty and the assumption of the 10-year rule, and then, of course, the first inklings of the Great Depression. And thus, for lack of money, they didn't really pursue that field to try and work through the problems, whereas the Japanese, when they started developing, they first experimented with oxygen enrichment and then obviously switched over to pure oxygen, they did encounter, in fact, the same issues that the British did at first, but they decided to put the money into pushing through with solving the issues, and of course they came up with the Long Lance and its submarine and airdropped derivatives. So, for lack of funding, the Royal Navy could have had maybe not necessarily a Long Lance style torpedo, because it's unlikely they would have seen a particular need for it, but certainly something with significant performance advantages over everything but a Long Lance. Architect 096 asks, given the importance of seasoned wood for ship construction during the Age of Sail, how exactly was the wood seasoned and stored before being put to use, and how long could you store the wood before it rotted away? Well, the unseasoned timber would be put in timber seasoning sheds. So these are some existing late 1700s era, so late 18th century timber sheds at Chatham Dockyard. And as you can see, they're actually an early example of mass construction because they're all built to a standard pattern and design. There were 75 of these built at Chatham, and as you can see, you have fairly big doors, almost the entire width of the frontage of each shed, and that's where you'd put the timber in. They've got a raised floor. You can see the brickwork for the floor there, which means that you don't have rising damp from the ground, and you have big slotted ventilation areas in the loft of the area, or the attic you might call it in the States, which you can also see in this picture, to get the air flowing and make sure you don't have a build-up of damp and so forth. And of course those slats can be adjusted, and it would just be left in there to season, and you could rough shape it once it had gone through a certain amount of seasoning, which would obviously help reduce the amount of space that was necessary. The interesting thing was, at the time that these sheds were built, the idea was that at a typical output of the shipyard, if all of these sheds were filled with seasoning timber, or seasoned timber, that would provide the dockyard with a 3-year supply of timber, even if they got no further timber coming in from exterior sources, which is obviously very good in wartime, just in case those supplies were disrupted, although they would obviously use those supplies up somewhat faster in wartime as well. Now, that's for your hull timbers. The interesting thing is your mast timbers are the exact opposite, whereas with seasoning the wood, you want it to be stored in a cool, dry environment, and stored there it could last for an exceptionally long time, years if not decades, if carefully managed. Mast timber's the other way around. For the mast timber, they had mast ponds. So you would take your timber, you would shape it approximately into what you needed for a mast, or possibly even most of the way, and then it would be submerged in the mast pond where it would soak. And as long as you kept it away from direct light so it didn't immediately start rotting, in a mast pond, by being kept soaked and calm, you actually stopped rot basically completely, as well as saturating it, which meant it kept its flexibility a lot more than a dried out piece of timber would be. And then when you needed it, you'd haul the mast timber out of the pond, let it dry a little bit, and then it was ready to install, which incidentally is the same principle as to why, for example, on the Great Lakes and a number of other areas, it was common practice when a wooden ship wasn't needed, but might be needed again 5-10 years down the line, to actually deliberately sink it in shallow water, because that was actually the best way of preserving it. You just then hauled it back up and dried it out when you needed it, a decade later, and that would preserve the ship far better than if you just left it outside in the open air. Necron Obama asks, although you covered what kinds of food different navies fed their sailors, I was left wondering if or how much the amount and quality of said food differed between the low-ranking sailors and the officers. And if these differences did exist, when did that come to an end? Well, I would argue it still hasn't come to an end, because the captain, admiral, etc., they will still have personal cooks on certain ships and in certain navies, and there will be a little bit more variety available for them, a little bit more catering to their personal needs, as a result of obviously being a relatively small audience, whereas the crew tend to get, here is generic food that has been prepared for you by, in bulk. So whereas a captain, let's say you're going to have steak. So everyone might have steak, but the captain might be served a nice big choice steak, and the chef or the cook will have prepared it the way the captain likes it. If he likes it medium rare, or if he's an absolute Philistine and likes it well done, that is how he will get his steak. Whereas if you're having a steak night for the rest of the crew, if you're lucky, you might find one done the way you want, but generally speaking, it'll be, here is a big tray of steak. Have fun. Choose one that you want, if you can get it first before someone else does. And that's pretty much it. And that's in a more modern navy. If you go back in time to the age of sail, then yes, there absolutely would be a huge difference in the amount and quality of food, because what small amount of preservation was able to be done in terms of things like, well, in the 19th century and onward, refrigeration, before big stock freezers came into play, and previous iterations thereof, whether that be like ice in straw or something like that. The choicest and freshest food would always go to the captain and the other senior officers, and usually they'd be provided with somewhat better rations as well. There'd be a standard ration per man, but there would be an extra allocation for the captain and the officers for the wardroom, and of course most captains and senior officers would also obviously have the money to provide additional food and drink themselves, wine or whatever they happened to want for the table. And then, of course, you have the rather wide variation in how corrupt or not your purser was. So if you had a really good purser who was both really good at the art of the deal and didn't really shortchange his crew because he wanted to keep on their good side, then the crew might have fairly generous amounts of food as far as the allocated rations went, and it would probably be fairly fresh and fairly decent quality. So it might not be all that far removed from what the captain was eating, except, of course, again, it would have to be prepared in ways that the galley could mass produce, whereas you could be a bit more refined with dishes for 1 or 2 or 3 officers. Whereas if you're in bad luck and the person perhaps wanted to get in with the captain but didn't care much about everybody else, then the captain might find himself with even more generous portions of even better quality food, and everybody else has stuff that's one step away from being rotten, or may indeed be partially rotten, and not available in large amounts at that. Jellicoe Cats asks, at what point was it clear that the pre-World War II accords concerning construction of new fortifications in the Pacific had broken down to the point where new construction could reasonably commence? Did the US have time to upgrade the defences of places like the Philippines, but choose not to expend resources on what was likely to be a lost cause? Essentially, you're looking at the mid-1930s, so 35-36, with the collapse of the Second London Naval Treaty System with Japan pulling out. That was kind of the starting gun for everybody rearming. People had been quietly ramping up rearming at that before then, but it really got into gear in the second half of the 1930s. The problem was that you had limited infrastructure, as I've discussed many times before, because of the running down of naval infrastructure, everything from gun forges to shipyards and so forth during the interwar period. Plus, while there is more money being released, it's not infinite amounts of money. And the construction of coastal fortifications in distant areas is not only fairly expensive, but actually a fairly long process, because you've got to do reconnaissance to work out where you're going to put the guns. You've then got to excavate the area. You've then got to bring the building materials in, possibly internationally, and then you've got to construct the whole thing and commission it. So they usually, if you're talking about serious coastal fortifications, it would usually take longer than building a full-on warship, because with a warship, the construction materials are just there, and you don't have to ship them all internationally and then potentially haul them up a hill, probably not with anything more than the muscle power of men and animals. But you also have to, as I said, actually excavate everything, whereas with building a ship, you just go, well, here's a dry dock, we put the bits together and hope for the best. And ultimately, coastal fortifications can only be in one place. So priority would go to things that can be in more than one place, because, if you've got a half dozen 16-inch guns going spare, well, is it better to grab another 3 from a store yard and go, right, we're going to build another battleship, which could then take those 9 guns all over the place? Or do you spend potentially a little bit longer building a set of coastal batteries to fit those guns, which can then not only not defend a different island, they can't even defend the whole of that island. They can only defend the approaches you put them in. So if the enemy goes into the next harbour up, well, what was the point of all that then? So new coastal and island fortifications of varying degrees received somewhat lower priority than actually building up and refitting the navies themselves, although they did try to put a lot of money into what they perceived as much easier reinforcements for bases. So airfields, new aircraft, anti-aircraft guns, and what, as far as the Navy was concerned at least, was light artillery, things like 5 and 6 inch guns. And that's what, for example, a lot of US carriers were doing in the immediate run-up to the US entry into the Second World War. They were running supplies, including whole batches of aircraft, to various island fortifications in the hope that, well, it was a lot quicker and easier to get a bunch of people to flatten a rough runway and then land a couple of squadrons of strike aircraft on there than it was to build a twin 14-inch gun emplacement, for example. George Robert asks, HMS Unicorn did her bit of shore bombardment in the Korean War, and HMS Formidable probably contributed in the Battle of Cape Matapan. Are they the only aircraft carriers to use their guns against enemies that weren't aircraft, or did other carriers also do this? Well, if you want to go into escort carriers, there were, of course, the escort carriers at the Battle of Samar who engaged the Japanese cruisers who were chasing them with the little 5-inch deck guns that they had. But outside of that, I think those that incident and the incidents that we just talked about in the question are probably the only ones where an aircraft carrier has used its heavy gun battery against a hostile target that wasn't an incoming aircraft. Because Glorious was far too far away to use any of its guns against the Scharnhorsts. Although I suppose if you really wanted to stretch the meaning of things, Megami did have that aft flight deck by the time she was sunk, and she did fire her guns at other targets at Surigao Strait, so maybe there's that. Coneled asks, what are some of the stupidest naval engineering solutions or decisions in the two following categories, purely from an engineering perspective, ignoring political or financial motivations? Firstly, the category of any idiot with a rudimentary understanding of engineering would have seen the problem. 2, I understand why you did it, but why would you choose to implement it the way that you did as opposed to, something that actually worked? And 3, there's no way this should work, but somehow it does? I think for item 1, there's a surprisingly and worryingly large pool of candidates to choose from. But I think, personally, I'd probably go, in terms of absolute obviousness, I would go with the excessively lightweight superstructures fitted on Japanese warships at the turn of the 1920s to the 1930s in an ostensible effort to comply with treaty limits, whilst simultaneously packing in the firepower on ships that, the same firepower from a ship that was actually far in excess of what the New London Treaty limits were. Because, to be honest, by that time period, the Japanese are already decided they're going to be disregarding certain elements of the naval treaties anyway. And I can understand, yes, there is a certain drive of, we can actually get everything close to the treaty limits with making the superstructure really nice and lightweight. However, at some point, when you look at some of the levels of thinness that were on some of these materials, any rudimentary understanding of engineering at that point would have gone, okay, we're getting to a point where some of the sheet metal we're using is thin enough that half the crew, given that they do practice martial arts, can probably put a significant and permanent dent in some of our superstructure sheet metal simply with a really good kick or punch. That is when you have to start wondering about the overall strength and viability of your ship. At which point, I would have gone, look, either we're ignoring the treaty limits anyway, so we can say, yeah, sure, it's 10,000 tons, but let's not go beyond a certain minimum thickness here. Or the other radical thing you could do is reduce the amount of superstructure. Have a smaller superstructure that is still strong enough to stand up, because, well, then you don't get things like the Fourth Fleet incident. For the second case of, I understand why you did it, but why this particular implementation? For that, again, actually, it's to do with stability. I would look at some of the US interwar destroyers, particularly the ones where they were making decisions like, do we include the splinter shield or not on this gun? Because if we do, it might make the ship unstable. And if we don't, if we just have essentially an open pedestal mounted gun, that might save just enough weight that we can have the armament and other equipment we want without compromising the stability of the ship. Now, the reason I put this in category 2 is because I can look at it and go, okay, from a purely technical standpoint, I do get the point. You know, the gun shield does weigh a few tons. Take that off. Okay, you now have brought it back down under the we're going to roll over at the slightest instance limit. However, I would like to draw your attention to the fact that if your design is so fine on its stability calculations that something as relatively minor as removing a gun shield or two is the difference between being unstable and just about acceptably stable, you have much larger problems than whether or not removing the gun shield is going to put you one side or the other of the calculations. At which point, I would be looking at it and going, there are other ways of doing this. Like, for example, on the Benhams, I would have gone, okay, I understand the attraction of 16 torpedoes, but honestly, you can only fire 8 of them per side, and yes, I know you want to be able to double back and fire another lot. But at this point, I think if you're that close and on weight, either put one of those quadruple mounts on the center line, delete another one, so you still have 8 torpedoes either side, but you've saved yourself the weight of an entire quad launcher and all its torpedoes, and then you might be able to have gun shields on all your guns. Or, if you're absolutely obsessed with having the ability to fire off 16 torpedoes, actually maybe, admittedly you don't necessarily know the Japanese have done this, but metaphorically take a leaf out of the Japanese Navy's book, stick a couple of quad launchers on the center line with a set of reloads and some reloading mechanisms, perhaps just some simple rams, and have them stored in fixed tubes fore and aft of the launchers. And there's no way this should work, but somehow it does, I'd actually stick with the US Navy again and point at the Bofors 40mm, because in terms of, shooting out with another gun, yes, the Bofors managed to outperform the Pom-Pom, but the Bofors, as initially adopted by the US Navy, was the most ridiculously finicky, extremely difficult to build, exceptionally fine-tuned weapon that there ever was. There was no way you were ever going to mass produce this thing. It was basically an artisanal piece every time one was constructed. And the US Navy's solution to this is, okay, we're going to pull it all apart, and then we're going to massively reduce the number of actual bits that make this thing up, completely standardize it, build it for mass production. And, you'd think something that's that intricately designed is intricately designed that way for a reason. So, theoretically, stripping it down to bare components, putting it together with a theoretically bare minimum of components in such a way that you can then mass produce it absolutely shouldn't work, but somehow it did. Kern van Krooning asks, why did the Royal Navy use a 68-pounder smoothbore gun in the mid-19th century when, long before that, navies had learned that cannon with shot weights of about over 40 pounds were rather impractical? Well, there are a few different reasons. Firstly, of course, they were expecting at the time of the gun's introduction to fire a considerable amount of shell, and shell, because it is partly hollow and filled with explosive, which weighs considerably less than just solid iron, weighs somewhat less. So a 68-pounder gun could fire a 68-pounder solid shot, but if it was firing an explosive shell, the explosive shell would weigh less. Another reason is that even with the shell, both shot and shell, they decided actually, these things are far too heavy for a single man to handle, and that was the big downfall of the 42-pounder back in the Age of Sail. It was just light enough that you could conceivably ask a single person to lift it up and try and fit it in the gun, but just heavy enough to not really work. Now, if you've got lots and lots and lots of guns packed in and you're aiming for rate of fire, you need a shot that can be loaded by one man. However, the 68-pounder is so much larger and offers so much more power that even though it takes up more space, you can afford to have two people lifting it, at which point essentially you're asking each person to lift about 34 pounds for a solid shot and somewhat less than that for a shell, which puts it back into that manageable position again. So if you go aboard HMS Warrior, where obviously they have a whole run of 68-pounders as deck guns on the gun deck, that is, then you'll see that unlike aboard HMS Victory, where the 32-pounders rounds are just there to be picked up by a single person, the 68-pounder shot actually have handles so that more than one person can pick them up. And of course, with 110-pounder, even more so, it's a three-man lifting job. At least in ideal circumstances. And with the time it would take to load, aim, and fire such a weapon, although rate of fire was appreciated, you weren't expected to kind of beat the clock the way a 32 or a 24-pounder would. Greb asks, taking each major navy of World War I and hand-waving away the plot armour needed to get into range, is there any World War I naval gun that can penetrate the belt armour of Yamato at 15 to 20,000 yards? The short answer is no. None of the guns are capable of that. So the most powerful, widely spread guns in service in World War I, and we're counting, it must be on a ship that's in service by 1918, well, you're looking at obviously the British 15-inch gun, and, well, it depends what figure you use, but at 15,000 yards or thereabouts, they're given a armour penetration capability of about 12 inches. Now, bearing in mind Yamato has 16 inches inclined, it's not even worth calculating the inclination effect of the belt because, well, 12 is 4 less than 16, so that's not getting through. Incidentally, it does have exactly 16 inches of penetration at about 18,500 yards, and admittedly at 8,500 yards, the inclination of the belt probably isn't helping too much, but roughly speaking, you're probably looking about 7,000 yards, maybe a little less, for a British ship armed with a 15-inch shell under optimal conditions to get through Yamato's armour. Then you've got the American 14-inch gun, not the 16-inch, because the Colorados didn't enter service till well after the First World War, and using the 14-inch 50 caliber Mark IV, the one that you'd find on the later US standards armed with a 14-inch gun. Again, at 15,000 yards, it's theoretically rated with a penetration value of about 9.5 to 10 inches. So it's not getting through either. And in fact, its margin for penetration of 16-inch armor, again, not accounting for angle, is around about 7.5 to 8,000 yards as well. Again, so about 6,500 yards would be what you'd need if you were an American standard with the later guns. And then you have the German 15-inch guns, and they have a slightly higher theoretical penetration at about 15,000 yards, probably notionally about 12.5, 13 inches, but still nowhere near enough to get through Yamato's armor. And again, to penetrate 16 inches of armor, you're looking at 8.5, maybe 9,000 yards, maybe a bit less depending on what table you use. So yeah, you're basically looking at 6,000 to 8,000 yards for any practical afloat World War I gun to penetrate Yamato's belt armor, assuming that you're shooting perpendicular to the ship. The only gun that theoretically might do it is HMS Furious with her single 18-inch gun, because that notionally has a side armor penetration value of 18 inches at 15,000 yards. And the angling of the armor doesn't give you 3 inches extra protection at 15,000 yards. So in a somewhat implausible battle where somehow the half-carrier HMS Furious with its one aft 18-inch gun has somehow magically managed to get to 15,000 yards and is directly perpendicular to Yamato, its one gun, assuming it somehow magically gets a hit, would maybe just about make it through Yamato's belt armor. I don't want to think what would happen to Furious in return, but there you go. Sildaran Machine Works asks, in World of Warships there are several Japanese ships with light anti-aircraft guns protected by sandbags. Did anybody do this in real life? I would think that a pile of sandbags would be heavier than a steel splinter shield. And do you have any other stories of improvised protection on warships? Well, there's the plastic armour and the concrete armour that I've mentioned before, and on Japanese warships, actually outside of the sandbags, you will also see hammocks used as a form of splinter shielding. There's a fairly famous picture of the bridge of Akagi with all the hammocks trussed up around it. But generally speaking, when you're looking purely at warships, most improvised protection is there essentially as splinter-proofing and potentially also a little bit of small arms fire, from strafing runs and such. Outside of the very, very earliest periods, like, for example, the USS Kearsarge draping chain over her, literal, big, thick links of chain, over her machinery spaces to stop the CSS Alabama putting holes in her. Once you get really beyond the 1860s, the sheer scale of armour you need to protect against any significant shell fire is pretty much beyond the realm of improvisation. But when it comes to these Japanese anti-aircraft installations with sandbags, as you can see here, yes, these are actually real. Well, obviously these exact things are digital assets in-game, but they represent something that was real. And that's in place for two reasons. Firstly, at least for the 25mm light AA, the Japanese didn't really go in for any kind of splinter shielding mounted on the gun, the way that you'd see perhaps on a 20mm Orlican. And you can actually see that reflected in the mounts on top of Yamato's B turret there, and in just to the left with a triple mounting. But what they did go for were these kind of angled gun tubs, again, as you can see represented, occasional circular ones, but these flat panel ones are found aboard Yamato. But you might be asking, okay, well, if they're not really going in for the metal blast shield, why are they going in for the sandbags? Because obviously these gun tub type arrangements, they are giving you a certain degree of mostly splinter and small arms protection from nearby hits. They're not obviously giving the crew direct protection if they get strafed, but, compromises are made in behalf of weight and stability, and perhaps even the thinking that if you put a couple of tons of steel plate on the guns, that'll make them slower to maneuver, and with that weight you might have been able to put more guns on, which might stand a better chance of shooting down the planes. But specifically note where these anti-aircraft guns are compared to the other ones in the picture. And if you go back over the various other warships that are shown with them, although Yamato is the most obvious one, you'll kind of see why. It's all to do with that 18.1-inch turret. You see, if those guns, that being the 18.1-inch guns, fire, all the other anti-aircraft guns you can see in this picture should generally be fine. And indeed, the anti-aircraft guns, in this case just to the starboard of the gun turret, will be fine. However, a nice big sail area, like, say, a plate of steel erected to protect the gun, the anti-aircraft gun that is very likely to, at minimum, be bent, at worst be just blown away by the shockwave of the explosion as the guns fire. Sandbags, meanwhile, yes, they do weigh a bit more, but for one thing, therefore slightly less likely to move because there's more mass to them, and two, if they do get scattered all over the place, it's not really that difficult to quickly put them back together again, assuming that they don't split. Tugtrash88 asks, what was the general size and structure of the Hanseatic Navy? By virtue of the Hansa being a decentralized network of city-states, was the Navy also decentralized in command? And if so, how did it operate to carry out assigned tasks? The answer is that there wasn't any particular Hanseatic Navy. For the majority of the period that the Hanseatic League was a significant force, there wasn't even separate states navies for the various Hanseatic cities. It was more the fact that, well, for the majority of the Hanseatic League's existence, warship and merchant ship were very often similar, if not identical, because a lot of it covers the period when you're not talking about cannon-armed warships. And so if there was the threat of pirates or something on a particular trade route, you just put some more crew on, or more soldiers specifically, on your trade ship and hope for the best, or you sent some of the bigger and slightly beefier ones with soldiers on board. If you had to go after pirates, and we know the Hanseatic League did occasionally conduct anti-piracy campaigns, then you had a choice. You could either get everyone together and they would agree after some negotiation on a leader, usually because there would be someone who was fairly well known among them as a good anti-piracy captain, and they would put together a collection of the bigger, meaner ships, or at least the ships that the League could spare at the time, stuff them full of soldiers with very little cargo and send them after the pirates, and that was pretty much that. Or, alternatively, if there was a pirate threat that was particularly annoying for one city, but perhaps not quite large enough for the entire League to really be bothered about, a city might go it alone, under pretty much the same kind of setup, just without all the discussion beforehand, or if there was, it would be internal political discussion. As you got into the latter stages of the Hanseatic League's existence and cannon-armed ships became the new way of fighting war, which as you can see here, then you began to see a differentiation between warship and merchant ship. Merchant ships could and would still be used as warships, and some merchant ships were designed to be particularly heavily armed, kind of a forerunner of the East Indiaman. But the cost of maintaining and running warships was quite a bit, and for a largely commerce-based Hanseatic League and the various city-states, what tended to happen is that warships might be constructed for a particular crisis, sometimes only completed after the crisis was over and never actually serve as warships, but even if they did, then the Hanseatic city-states would very rapidly try and downsize, either by reconverting the warship back into a merchant ship, or by just finding a customer to sell it onto, which is why in the recent Anthony Roll video, you saw a whole slew of ex-Hanseatic ships serving in the Tudor Navy, because they were big enough and beefy enough and scary enough to be purchased by Henry VIII as warships, even if their somewhat mercantile origins made them slightly less heavily gunned than true dedicated warships, even in the Tudor period. But towards the end of the Hanseatic League period, you saw ships like you've seen here. This is the Premier Model's Wappen von Hamburg, which I've actually covered in a 5-minute guide a little while ago. And these were termed convoy ships, so they were warships, as you might guess, but they were specifically geared towards convoy escort. So they weren't absolute full-scale, all-singing, all-dancing, top-rate ships of the line, but they were significantly stronger than your average frigate at the same time. And, they could transport a little bit of cargo on the side as well, so they were most of the way towards being warships, a bit like some of the more aggressive Dutch flutes, from a roughly similar time period or slightly earlier. And so, while, in this case, obviously, Wappen von Hamburg is from Hamburg, various Hanseatic Leagues states would have various warships at their disposal, but again, it would vary quite considerably as to numbers, depending on how bad a crisis was presenting itself at the time, although by the late 1500s, early 1600s, most Hanseatic city-states would at least have a few. Scott Jennings asks, while on vacation in the Melbourne area, my family visited Fort Queenscliff. Unfortunately, we were not able to take the tour due to not having our passports on hand at the time. Could you please take a few moments to talk about the history of the fort? Well, when I was in Australia and in Melbourne, a friendly neighbourhood Aussie took me over to, the opposite of Fort Queenscliff, Fort Nepean, which is on the eastern end of Melbourne Harbour. So this picture is about as close as I got to Fort Queenscliff, which you can just about see there on the horizon. This is at the entrance to the harbour in which Melbourne sits. And the history of the two is interlinked. Fort Queenscliff, or rather the open gun battery that would become Fort Queenscliff, slightly predates Nepean, essentially because if you look at a map of the entire bay, Melbourne is the original Melbourne, that is at least, is kind of at about the 10:30, 11 o'clock position within the bay, and the western side of the bay is slightly shorter than the eastern, which meant that getting both materials and communications links down to the western end was slightly easier than to the eastern, And so the first gun battery was set up at what would eventually become Fort Queenscliff to command the entrance, which you can see here, which is only a couple of miles, if that, wide, and not all of it is navigable, as you can probably tell from the breakers. So fairly narrow area, very easily defended. The only problem is that the entrance into the harbour essentially means that you come north, if you're coming into the harbour, which would be from the left in this picture, and then you have to curve around almost 90 degrees through a channel and then turn, so you're heading east, and then you head north again off towards Melbourne. So Melbourne is kind of just to the extreme right on the extreme horizon in this picture, or maybe just a little bit out of picture. So you're describing an S shape, which of course means that where Queenscliff is allows you to very, very easily defend the channel itself, and also, by turning your guns around, defend the harbour from ships trying to escape, but affords you not quite as much capability to defend from ships coming in, i.e. ships have to come into the channel trying to get in before you can really fire on them, unless you have spotters out, because the peninsula that Nepean sits on, or would eventually sit on, is kind of in the way, which is what prompted the development of Fort Nepean, Fort Cheviot, and a bunch of other forts to essentially provide enfilade fire on ships trying to get in and out of the harbour when they weren't wanted to, and also for the forts on the eastern side, they could much more easily directly engage ships that were out at sea on a much wider arc. But Queenscliff, being the original, was kind of the command and control fort for everything, because as I said, it started out as an open gun battery, and then in the 1870s, when they started worrying about the Russians and various other people coming down, but mostly the Russians, Queenscliff, Nepean, Cheviot, and a couple of other forts were all built up into much more extensive facilities with, actual fortifications as opposed to just some guns behind a sandbank. And most of them, as far as I'm aware, certainly Nepean and Queenscliff, can be visited down to this day with various guns in various states of repair all present. And once the whole system was built up, the fact that Queenscliff was the command fort actually made a lot of sense, because, as mentioned, it had a slightly better view into the harbour for ships that might be trying to escape, and much as it didn't have a direct line of sight to as much of the open sea as Nepean and some of the other forts did, it therefore was slightly better protected. So if you had spotters over where I'm taking the photo, if you spun around 180 degrees, you could then radio in or telegraph in or telephone in and say, all right, you can direct your guns, 9.2 inch, 8 inch guns, etc. You could direct those to fire over the headland to assist the guns of the direct fire forts, but it meant that your command and control facilities were a little bit safer, because if an enemy force was bombarding the outer forts, well, that wouldn't disrupt said command and control facilities because they weren't there. And at the point at which Queenscliff potentially might fall under enemy assault would be when the enemy was essentially forcing their way into the harbour, which was pretty much the last line of defence anyway. Harvey V asks, were Age of Sail cannons typically cast or forged on site at the shipyards, or were they made elsewhere and then transported to the shipyards? Not typically at shipyards, although you might find cannon foundries in towns or cities where shipyards are, but that wasn't necessarily strictly because there were shipyards building warships in those areas, at least in the Age of Sail. It was more to do with the materials required to make cannon. Essentially, where a foundry would be located was a balance of easy access to materials versus the presence of civilization, because obviously you need lots of raw materials to make a cannon, but you also need a relatively developed civilizational centre nearby to supply the skilled artisans, the labour, and all the other amenities and stuff, because, being a fairly specialist trade, a cannon foundry would need the support of at least a large town because of all the other services that they would need, even down to basic food and shelter. And what this meant was that cannon foundries could usually be found in one of two areas: forts or in the middle of a country. and as I said, this is all largely dependent on resources. Back in the day when you're talking about bronze guns, then essentially you're mostly looking at where are the big trade ports, because there were vanishingly few countries that had ready native access to a good supply of tin and a good supply of copper for making bronze. Those that did could, well, the one or two that did could be a little bit freer about where they put things, but generally speaking, if you were going to make bronze cannon, whichever resource you could easily access, fine, but whichever one you couldn't really readily access, you needed to trade for, at which point it made more sense to have a foundry in or near the city which could receive the shipments from overseas, whether that be copper, tin, or both, because then you had to relatively minimally transport your expensively imported product to a foundry to turn into a cannon, or, well, anything else that the foundry might make out of that bronze. Now, as time went on and iron guns replaced bronze guns, well, to a certain extent, a lot of those port-based foundries would continue, simply because, well, you already had a cannon foundry, you might as well keep using it. That was cheaper than setting up an entirely brand new one. But other iron gun foundries, as I said, would spring up pretty much in the middle of the country where you could find a town or a village or something. And that was because if you're going to smelt down huge quantities of iron, bearing in mind that if you're trading in copper or tin, it usually arrives in, roughly speaking, at least pure form already. But if you're already having to mine the iron ore, so you've got a mine set up somewhere, you're then having to refine the iron ore down into iron, and then you're going to have to find all sorts of fuel, whether that be charcoal, coke, wood, whatever you're using for the fires, and so on and so forth. All of that is quite bulky, so you don't really want to go through the expense of transporting large amounts of fuel and large amounts of raw material to a completely separate third area just to create the iron with which you will cast your guns. At which point, if you're creating a facility to refine your iron ore down into actual iron, you might as well have the gun foundry there as well, rather than even just transporting pig iron around. And thus, when you look at, for example, the UK, which is a little bit of an anomaly because we do have pretty good tin deposits down in Cornwall, therefore bronze cannon foundries could be a little bit more, not randomly, but a little bit less coastally based. And then you also have the Port of London, which is a very busy port and a natural place to put the Royal Armouries, because it's also the capital, but also not a coastal town. But you could also have a gun foundry in Oxford, and there was one there for a very, very long time. Because, well, you could bring fuel and raw materials to Oxford relatively centrally to the southern part of the UK, or England as it was at the time, and create your guns. Now, that doesn't rule out having a gun foundry on site at a shipyard, but it wouldn't be the common occurrence. Whether the gun foundry was the other side of town or 3 counties away or whatever, usually the gun foundry and the shipyard were 2 separate entities, in no small part because, of course, a gun foundry would also be supplying forts and the army and whatever else they were supplying where they weren't casting big artillery, and so the guns would generally have to be transported to the shipyard. Jesus Hinojosa asks, Nelson was shot by a sniper in the rigging of a French ship. How common was this type of tactic, and did any navy or captain ever champion its use? What sort of special fittings were added to masts and rigging, like a sniper's nest of some sort? The general idea of placing men with long arms up in the rigging of a ship, more specifically on fighting tops on masts, was basically par for the course in most large age of sail ship engagements, to some degree or another. The thing was, you did have a little bit of a balance to play with, because you didn't have that many Marines. Obviously, most ships would have a Marine contingent, but it wasn't that large a contingent, and the Marines were also there as a fighting force to help secure the deck of the ship against enemy boarding action, and thanks to the relatively slow rate of fire of muskets of the period, if you stuck a bunch of Marines up in the fighting tops, they could provide good covering fire, but they really weren't going to be able to do all that much to stop
a physical takeover of the main deck by a boarding party. So while there would usually be someone up there, it wouldn't usually be many people. And so, there wouldn't be a particular kind of, oh yes, we are putting a sniper nest up here. It was just the spotting and fighting top. And since battle sail usually involved the lower course of sails being furled, it meant that you didn't have to worry quite as much about things getting in the way, although mast sails and rigging could get in the way, which is another issue restricting your field of fire. The other problem, of course, is that while the musket's inaccuracy is sometimes a bit overblown, at the end of the day, it is a smoothbore weapon firing a hand-forged lead ball. It is not the world's most accurate weapon, and becomes decidedly less so if you are, 50 foot up a mast on a ship that's swaying, and you're at the, not quite the pinnacle, but almost the pinnacle of that sway, trying to fire at a target that is presumably on another ship, which is doing its own independent swaying. And of course, if you're confined to a fighting top, you're also, if you draw attention to yourself, potentially a rather inviting target for a whole bunch of people down on the deck, which, whilst it is technically swaying at the same rate, is not swaying anywhere near as violently because, in pendulum effect, and or small cannon and swivel guns and so on and so forth. So it's not exactly a safe posting once somebody takes notice that you're there. In terms of did navies or captains champion the use of quote-unquote snipers up in the rigging, not as a whole in terms of navies. As I said, it was pretty much a par for the course accepted tactic, but specific captains could champion their use, and that they'd also use things like grenades to clear the deck and so forth. It really depended on what kind of action the captain thought they were going to fight, because if you were, for example, planning a Royal Navy style cannonade them into submission, rake the decks with grape shot, and then move in for a boarding action, the net effect of half a dozen men with muskets up in the tops of the mast, either defensively or offensively, really isn't going to make that much odds, other than potentially picking off the guys doing the same thing for the other ship. Whereas if you were aiming for perhaps a ship where for whatever reason that your gunnery isn't going to be brilliant, like say if you are Captain Luca stuck on the Redoutable in Cadiz and you haven't been to sea in months, then you might emphasize it an awful lot more because, well, it's actually possible to train and drill people in hand-to-hand fighting and in sniping from masts, whereas the Spanish will probably take a rather dim view if you started cannonading half of Cadiz every few days for practice. HMS Albatross asks, what was the reason that the Italian, French and German navies chose 15-inch guns for their last classes of battleships instead of 16-inch guns? Was the first nation that finalised their design unable to come up with a larger gun, and the other two chose to match them, or something else? There's a combination of factors involved. Partly, there is a kind of, we don't want to upset the apple cart too much and trigger an escalating gun arms race, even though a general naval arms race was kind of developing. That was a factor to a certain degree, so kind of mirror matching your opponents in caliber, but very much, I think, a secondary one for the most part when you consider everybody who's making new 15-inch ships as a whole. Another aspect to it is that in terms of completed guns or guns for which they have done a very serious amount of research, all three nations, Italy, France and Germany, had either manufactured or in some cases come close to manufacturing a series of 15-inch naval guns already in World War I, so they knew they had the industry set up to be able to actually do that, and they had a bunch of research to work on. But another factor was weight and size. And you might think, well, the difference for a 15 and a 16-inch gun shouldn't make too much odds, but you'd be surprised, bearing in mind everybody was trying to fit these guns, at least ostensibly and at first, into treaty-compliant ships. So if you compare the 15-inch 45 caliber guns on the Richelieu class with the 16-inch 45 caliber guns found on the South Dakotas and the North Carolinas, the American guns tip the scales at just a fraction under 100 tons, including the breech block, The French guns are about 94 tons. Now you might think, oh, 6 tons isn't too much of a difference. But bearing in mind Richelieu has 8 guns, so that's actually 48 tons just in the gun's weight, not accounting for the fact that, of course, the mountings to carry a 16-inch gun, or several 16-inch guns, are going to have to be a little bit stronger. The turret's going to have to be a little bit bigger, which means more armour is needed because the greater area of the turret gun house assembly, wider barbettes, etc. All of this adds up to actually quite a lot of weight, and then you have to multiply that across however many turrets you're going to have, and suddenly you could be talking hundreds of tons. And similarly, the Italian and German guns, which are around about 50 calibers long, are about 10 tons lighter than the 16-inch 50 as found on the Iowas. So again, if you're looking at an 8 or 9 gun, you're already saving 80 to 90 tons in those cases, plus all the other factors I just mentioned, which again will run into the hundreds of tons. The Iowa's turrets, being triples, outmass the Littorio's turrets by almost 200 tons, although I'd be a little bit more hesitant using that as an indication because, of course, a good chunk of that weight difference might well be down to how much armour both nations have chosen to slap onto their turrets. So not necessarily the best comparison in terms of for looking at turret weight, but it is still a thing. And all this rides on the back of what actually quite a lot of nations had concluded in the mid-1930s, which was that it was impossible to have a balanced, well-protected design with 16-inch guns and a modern anti-aircraft suite, etc., on 35,000 tons. And therefore, if you stepped down to a 15-inch armament, it was concluded that was probably the biggest caliber of guns you could get a reasonable number on to a ship and still have a good balance between speed, protection, firepower, and all the other important ancillary subjects. And before anyone brings up the North Carolina and South Dakota, the North Carolina had the problem of not being armoured against her own guns at the expected battle range, which was, one of the fundamental things about what people thought a battleship actually was. And the South Dakotas, while they did have that protection, were, of course, shorter and far more compact than the North Carolinas, specifically to get them under that 35,000-ton weight limit, and therefore they had a bunch of other compromises which the US Navy wasn't entirely happy with. It showed you could get a 16-inch armed ship with decent protection on 35,000 tons, but you had to accept a whole bunch of other inefficiencies to do so. Like, for example, the fact you needed almost 10,000 more shaft horsepower than the North Carolinas and couldn't quite move as quickly. Or you couldn't carry quite as much fuel, so you couldn't go quite as far. As well as the usually known stuff about the ships being quite compact and a little bit cramped in other ways. Stefan Pirot asks, nearly every European country in possession of a piece of coastline seems to have a proud naval heritage. Brits, French, Dutch, Spanish, German, Portuguese, Italian, Danish, etc. I am unfortunate enough to hail from a small country called Belgium, which you might have heard of. Yes, indeed. Now, as far as I know, Belgium is a country that since 1830 has had no remarkable naval feats to its name. Even in your video reviewing the feats and actions of the Free Navies during World War II, had Belgium with not a lot to show for itself. Do you know of any special feats in which there is some redemption for the Belgian Navy? Well, in the time period the channel covers, Belgium had this annoying habit of disbanding its navy, every so often as an economy measure, which meant that there were good chunks of the 19th and 20th centuries where Belgium didn't really have a navy and therefore couldn't really do anything navally, although on the occasions when it did exist, obviously there were some things to do. However, while, as you rightly point out in my video on the Free Navies of Europe, the Belgian Navy didn't have a huge amount to do, mostly because of its relatively small size. A handful of patrol craft, some minesweepers and a couple of corvettes, which were donated to it by the British. I would, however, point out that considering that at the start of World War II, when it was invaded, the entire Belgian Navy, officers and men included, pretty much all fit into one small trawler. And I'm not even joking. The fact of the matter is, like a number of other free navies, the majority of the Belgian Navy decided, yes, our country is invaded and is falling under the control of the Nazis. However, we do not accept this, and we're determined to fight on. So they just literally packed themselves up onto this ship, sailed over the channel, and rocked up and said, "Hi, we're a bunch of very angry Belgians, and we'd like to shoot Nazis until the war is over, please." At which point the British sort of looked at them and went, "Okay, let's give these men some ships," and point their guns that way. So, although the numbers and sizes of the ships of the Belgian Navy are perhaps or the Free Belgian Navy, I should say, during World War II, are not perhaps comparable to the Free French Navy or the Free Norwegian Navy, etc. I would point out two things. Firstly, I'm pretty sure that as a percentage of total men and officers in the Navy, the Free Belgian Navy probably had the single highest percentage of them essentially defect over to become the Free Belgian Navy. And secondly, while the two Belgian corvettes, at least as far as we know, didn't actively manage to sink any U-boats, they did damage or drive off quite a number of U-boats, and therefore, based purely on statistical averages in terms of the ships those U-boats were trying to engage, and, therefore did not engage and therefore did not sink, I would put reasonably decent money that there are several hundred, if not several thousand people living across the world, probably mainly located in the UK, but also, across various other nations, who wouldn't be here today if it wasn't for the Free Belgian Navy and their corvettes making sure that those U-boats didn't send their fathers or grandfathers to the bottom of the Atlantic. Lord Druken asks, the USS Kearsarge BB-5 is the only US battleship not to be named after a US state. Do you know why this might be the case? Was it because the naming conventions for battleships in the US Navy had not yet quite been settled in the time period she was constructed, or were there other reasons for this singular discrepancy? It was a combination of two fairly important factors. Firstly, exactly what the US was going to name various large vessels was still a little bit in flux. So, broadly speaking, the idea of battleships carrying state names and cruisers carrying city names was mostly in place, but there were a few exceptions to that rule. For example, in cruisers, most, admittedly, there were cities, but there were a few cruisers in US naval service which were definitely not named after cities. And later on, after Kearsarge was actually constructed, you would, of course, have a number of armoured cruisers named after states, ostensibly because of their potential place in the battle line, which then had to be renamed when the state names were appropriated for full-on battleships. And then all this played into with the fact that at the time that the Kearsarge was being ordered, and designed and ordered, that is, the USS Kearsarge, one before it, the one that sank CSS Alabama in the American Civil War, had just been lost in a wreck, which meant, people were a bit conscious about the fact, our historic ship, very famous, did this famous thing in the American Civil War, has just been lost. And, put together the fact that it's not 100% set in stone yet that you have to name a battleship after a state. And this recent loss, then everyone went, why don't we name one of our new battleships after the Kearsarge to carry on the name? And so one of the ships was therefore named Kearsarge. A bit like, in some ways, how HMS Victory got its name, because they weren't necessarily sure what they were going to name Victory when she was under construction, except for two things. One, they'd just recently lost another first rate called HMS Victory, a bit like how the US Navy had just lost the sloop of war Kearsarge, and then they had a bunch of actual naval victories, so they thought, we'll put two and two together and we'll call this new one Victory as well. Similarly with Kearsarge. Larry G asks, looking at photos of World War I and interwar battleships, there appears to be rows of portholes along the hull. Were they portholes, and if so, were these for interior lighting, and how did they affect the ship's armour? If they were for lighting, was electric lighting uncommon or unreliable at the time? I don't see them on the Iowa class and various other World War II grade ships. So the portholes in question, they actually serve a double purpose. Lighting, yes, but also ventilation, because the vast majority of ships that you will see them on didn't have air conditioning, certainly for the majority of their service lives at the time that they were constructed. So with that dual purpose role in mind, they don't affect the ship's armour, because where the ship is armoured to any substantial degree, you just don't put the portholes. So, and you can actually see this if you look at most battleships. I mean, this is the front part of HMS Norfolk, a county-class cruiser, but the rule generally holds firm. If you scan your eyes along the hull of a ship, a warship at least, then where there are portholes, then that basically means the armour there is either non-existent, it's just hull material, or maybe splinter-proofing at most. And where there aren't portholes, that's where the armour almost certainly is. A very obvious example of this is if you look at HMS Belfast on the River Thames. There'll be a continuous run of portholes on the first fully enclosed deck, but then you go down a level and, oh, look, there's a big blank space, and that's, unsurprisingly, where the central protection mixture of bulges and armour belt is present. So you generally don't have air conditioning, at least initially. You probably don't have brilliant ventilation, and hence why portholes are very useful for this, as well as obviously dehumidifying to a certain degree. But the other thing you've got to remember is that electricity I wouldn't necessarily say is unreliable. The electricity grid on earlier ships is a little bit more fragile, but especially on capital ships, there's actually another factor to bear in mind, which is power demand. Now, later ships, where you start to have auxiliary generators and backups and so forth, don't suffer from this quite as much, as well as suffering from, not suffering from, having better, more redundant circuits generally, plus having better circulation and aircon systems, therefore they don't need the portholes. But in older ships, when you were in battle, for instance, if all the turrets on a ship needed to turn continuously to track a target, and the guns needed to elevate, and all of these motors had to remain active because both the tracking in terms of elevation and in terms of angle of the turret are continuously being updated, the sheer amount of power demanded by that, plus of course the engines and other vital systems, could match or exceed the total power output of the ship in terms of electricity. And that would mean things like lighting or ventilation, if you had any, would be the first to go to divert power to, actually fighting the ship. At which point, having natural light, probably a very good idea, unless you wanted to plunge large portions of the interior of the ship into complete darkness when you went to full battle stations. Andrew Dederer asks, the turboelectric drive was apparently abandoned during the treaty era, although revived for some smaller ships during World War II, mainly due to its size and tonnage issues, since everything at that point was coming down to tonnage. Were there any other technologies that were killed off or hibernated by the treaty era, not just gun size limitations? Yes, although I think I'll probably divide them into two separate categories. First category, you would have things like mass manufacture of ships' armour and ships' guns. Now, the technology to make battleship armour or make battleship guns wasn't necessarily lost entirely, obviously, but the ability to produce them at scale was lost by, the lack of demand causing the downsizing of shipyards and gun foundries and armour foundries and so on and so forth. You could potentially also argue to a certain degree some technology, when it came to producing them, was killed off or hibernated. Now, there were advances in the metallurgy that made up, for example, battleship armour plates in some countries. However, because of the treaty limit on gun sizes, new guns in 18, 19, 20 inch or more calibers weren't really being developed, unless you happen to be Japan and weren't obeying the treaties anyway. And that meant, commensurately, there wasn't really a drive to construct armour plate that was strong enough to withstand an 18 or a 20 inch shell, and therefore some of the necessary technology that would be needed to make face-hardened armour, 17, 18, 20 inches thick, wasn't developed. The theory was there, but the development of that technology wasn't necessarily there. Now, those particular dimensions I'm referring to are in terms of belt armour. Now, of course, various navies did have turret faces that thick or thicker, but a turret face is a, generally speaking, much smaller area than a whole battleship's belt, and at least by this period tends to be flat, so you don't have to worry about the shaping requirements to match the hull, assuming you're doing an external belt, not an internal one. And of course you have, like that massive faceplate that's sitting around in the US from one of the Yamato class's gun turrets, which is 26 inches thick, I think, but you can see from the problems with the metallurgy of that particular sample just how difficult it was to cast something that big and that thick. And so the general point is essentially, if you didn't have the treaties, that kind of technology would have still been difficult, but would have been a lot more commonplace by the mid-1930s. You could also argue, at least in terms of a hibernation, large, powerful diesel engines, because the single biggest driver for those power plants in the interwar period was initially the surge of interest in very large cruiser submarines. And then, of course, them being curtailed by the later treaties meant that while you did have, 3,500 horsepower diesel engines being produced, if you hadn't had the treaty limits in place, you would have perhaps had considerably larger diesels in demand. And of course, that technology, small, compact, high-power diesels, would have allowed more advances for diesel-powered warships in the Second World War, because, of course, as we've covered multiple times, the technological state of diesel engines, whether it be in Germany, the States, Britain, etc., while considerably more advanced than it was in World War I, wasn't quite advanced enough to give the same power density as, say, steam turbine propulsion, even though it was a lot closer than it had been. Reva's Rambling Recess asks, just how significant were the differences in World War II propulsion technology between the competing nations' warships? I know the French had especially high-performance systems in the Richelieus, for instance, but how did the best of the latest ships compare with the worst, and what difference did it actually make? What sort of speed differences might have happened if the best systems were swapped with the worst, and vice versa, for the navies in question? So, for most propulsion systems, you're essentially looking at the boilers, assuming you're talking about steam turbine systems, because the turbines themselves, comparative to the boilers, don't take up that much space. Now, yes, I know they do take up a fair amount of space, but honestly, you could have a turbine set that was 10-20% bigger or smaller than the average, and it wouldn't make a huge amount of difference to your overall machinery spaces. Whereas if you have a boiler that's 10% or 20% bigger or smaller than the average, because of the much greater size of those boilers, that will make an awful lot more difference. So, you could have a smaller turbine set and a bigger boiler, and overall you'd have more machinery space, whereas if you had a bigger turbine and a smaller boiler, you'd have less machinery space. Anyway, the three things that you really have to bear in mind when it comes to your steam turbine propulsion systems are power density, reliability, and manpower requirements. Now, there is something to be said about efficiency and therefore overall range and so forth as well, but realistically, when it comes to the propulsion systems, it's the first three that you need to think about. Now, power density is, of course, how much horsepower are you generating per square foot of space on the ship's deck that you're taking up, or you could perhaps rate it by per cubic foot or meter if you want to do metric. And that tells you, if we have a standard system with a standard power density, obviously if you have a higher power density, you can either produce more power and therefore go faster for the same amount of space taken up, or you can go at the same speed as everybody else, but your machinery spaces will be smaller, therefore saving you weight and allowing you to devote that space to either more guns or displacement to more armour, or maybe make the ship overall smaller and therefore cheaper. Reliability then is the next one, because of course you could go for an extremely power dense system that will allow you to go around with a very minuscule engine at very, very high speeds and potentially even at very, very long ranges. But if it breaks down every 5 minutes, that's not necessarily the best bet. Whereas obviously if you have a slightly less power dense system, that might be more reliable, but you might need more machinery to go somewhere. And that's a fair bit of a trade-off. And then the last thing, which is kind of related to both of the previous ones, is manpower. Because if you're having to think about just staffing 1 or 2 battleships and you've got a relatively large nation, that's not really so much of a problem. However, if you've got to staff 10, 15, 20 battleships, and bearing in mind that this kind of whatever technology you use in your battleships, at least as far as boilers are concerned, is probably going to be used in other ships in the fleet as well, then the difference between having an engineering crew of, say, 250 versus an engineering crew of 600 can make quite a bit of difference. Not only in overall terms of, well, we might be adding thousands or tens of thousands of men to our overall fleet roster, but also if you're going to have, if we use that example, a crew of 250 or a crew of 600 for your machinery, well, if you've got the 600, that means another 350 berths you've got to find, and food for another 350 people, and therefore the ancillary crew to support all of that. So it is actually a fairly major requirement when you look at things across the board. While not strictly battleships, in the immediate post-war environment, one of the major reasons that Canada, for example, chose to operate a pair of British carriers, although only really one at a time, when they were offered Essex class, was simply that the manpower requirements for the British carriers' machinery was so much lower than the Essex class. So yeah, the Essex class objectively were bigger, faster ships, but that manpower requirement was much, much larger. Even on a proportional basis, it was considerably more. Now, the one problem with doing this via a dry dock answer rather than doing it as a Fun Friday is that for a Fun Friday, I'd probably sit down with the plans for each World War II era capital ship and work out the total machinery floor space area, and then I could give you power density as well as other figures, and maybe I will do that at some point in the future. But just looking purely at amount of machinery versus amount of horsepower generated, you can see some relatively radical differences popping up here and there. So in terms of efficiency of machinery tonnage versus horsepower generated, at least using the figures that I pulled from various books, and there are slight disagreements in various books about exactly how much tonnage each bit of machinery is and how much horsepower was generated as standard, and so forth. So this is only ballpark because you use slightly different figures and you might set things off slightly differently. So the least efficient machinery would be the Littorios. Now, of course, the Littorio did get up to 30 knots, but she only generates 32.05 horsepower per ton. Now, the interesting thing is, especially since you mentioned the Richelieu's, and I would agree they do have very good machinery, is that Richelieu and Bismarck are actually then the near enough joint second worst. They're both 33 point something. So Bismarck's 33.32 horsepower per ton, Richelieu's 33.65 horsepower per ton. And this is why I say you have to take into account power density as well, which these figures can't do. Because although they have very, very similar horsepowers per ton, and in absolute terms, Richelieu actually has slightly heavier machinery, Richelieu does also manage 2 knots more with that machinery, and she manages to do that using only about 60% of the floor space for the machinery compared to Bismarck, thanks mostly to those artificial circulation boilers. Then there's the North Carolina class with about 38 horsepower per ton. Then the King George V's with just under 40 horsepower per ton, very closely matched by Vanguard, which is just over 40 horsepower per ton, which shouldn't be a huge shock considering they're using almost the same machinery. And then finally, you have the obviously North Carolina has a high pressure unit as well, but the Iowa's high pressure systems generating 47.7 horsepower per ton. So if you took the lowest power density, that's the Littorios, the Iowas, at least on a horsepower per ton basis, appear to be generating about a third more power. So that actually is quite significant. Although, as I say, all of this is purely reflective of amount of horsepower generated per ton of machinery. It doesn't actually tell us much about how much floor space that machinery takes up, and therefore how dense it is, how power dense it is, and how much more you could potentially fit into a different hull. Rob Smith asks, a quick glance at a map of Europe shows that some countries have much longer coastlines than others. It would also appear that countries with long coastlines have much larger civil and military fleets over the years. Is this true, and does this explain in part why Germany has such a small navy compared to, say, France or Spain? It's somewhat true, as generally speaking, a longer coastline will mean more coastal settlements, therefore more reliance on the sea, and a higher population of seafarers relative to your overall population, which of course then means that protecting the livelihood of those coastal dwelling populations is both more important, and you have a bigger manpower pool with which to protect said interests. However, it's also dependent on a few other things. How hospitable the coastline is, for a start. For example, as you can see here, Norway and Italy, for example, both have huge coastlines, but don't ever really historically have fleets to challenge some of the other major European naval powers. And that's a combination of population density in total, how many people do you actually have, plus how hospitable is that coastline. A lot of Norway's coastline just isn't suitable for basing ships from. There's relatively limited numbers of ports. Accessibility of trade, which is one of the great drivers of both wealth from the sea and the need to defend said wealth. And, of course, land borders. Land borders are the other really, really important thing, because the more land border you have with some other nations, if those nations are hostile to you, or could potentially be hostile to you, or a threat, then you have to spend proportionally more and more money on an army, which is going to divert resources away from your navy. Now, you could cheat a little bit like France did for a long time and just have a massive population and with a reasonable degree of development thereby generating a lot of money, so you can afford to have a big army and a fairly big navy. You could be like Spain and loot an entire continent for a couple of 100 years, which means that you have huge amounts of money to fund a very large navy, even if, although Spain has a fairly long coastline, remember a good chunk of it was depopulated for a very long time by people like the Barbary pirates. But generally speaking, if you look at the proportion of wealth spent by most European continental powers on land forces versus navy, it's almost proportional to the amount of border they have with other people. So, for example, with Germany, although it proved it could build a fairly large fleet, the simple fact of the matter was the army was always going to demand a huge amount of resources, and when the army snapped back into wanting those resources in 1912, it very badly starved the German building program. Britain has a slightly unique capability in that once the Act of Union went through, it didn't have any hostile land borders in Europe, and it had a lot of coastline, and it was well situated for trade. But broadly, I would say that your assessment is generally correct as long as you also factor in how much of a land border with other countries does the nation in question have, and how hostile are the nations on those borders. So, for example, France in the early 20th century has a very hostile unified Germany to its east, but for a good chunk of its history, it was a whole bunch of random German states, occasionally pretending to be the Holy Roman Empire, at which point you could devote more resources to the fleet because although you needed a big army, particularly just in case war kicked off with Spain, you didn't need as big an army. Camino John asks, what is the naval equivalent of the Montparnasse derailment, which is one of the most famously photographed accidents involving trains with a locomotive almost comically at rest face down in the street below? What is a naval equivalent? Well, I think it depends on if you mean iconic as in everyone looks at it and goes, yes, that is a navy thing, or iconic as in specifically that is a naval accident or disaster thing. Because iconic naval photos probably going to depend on where you're from. So, for example, this picture of HMS Dreadnought, extremely recognisable in the UK, whereas this picture of USS Pennsylvania leading the one of the US battle lines in World War II, probably much more famous in the US. But I think if you wanted to go with a naval disaster picture, then I think this or a few other similar ones of the Arizona probably would get universal recognition as a kind of our direct equivalent of the Montparnasse railroad accident. I think the other one that probably most people have seen, thanks to various documentaries and such, is probably the Svent Istvan keeling over. So yeah, between Arizona and Svent Istvan, those are probably the... If you ask someone, what does a battleship sinking look like, they're going to think of one of those two first. Snowstalker36 asks, I heard the US Navy made a few Fletchers with scout planes. Why? Did someone want to make the world's tiniest light cruiser? Essentially, this is a direct outgrowth of the rather horrific attrition of US scouting forces in late 1942 during the Guadalcanal campaign. So in 1943, of course, the US Navy was thinking about going back on the offensive, but they faced a little bit of a problem when it came to finding the enemy, scouting. So they did have the first of the Essex class coming online, but given the fact that they'd lost Wasp, Lexington, Yorktown, and Hornet, they only had Enterprise and Saratoga left, and one of those was in deep repair. Essentially, just because they had a few of the Essex class coming online didn't actually mean they had that large a carrier fleet initially. Obviously, there were some independences coming up as well. So the carriers being limited in number meant you needed scouting assets. Now, normally, for surface scouting, you'd use destroyers, but quite a lot of those had been knocked out, damaged, or sunk during the Guadalcanal campaign. New Fletchers were coming online, which was good, but you'd also had quite a number of cruisers taken out, both of the heavy and light variety, although significantly casualties amongst heavy cruisers, again, both sunk and crippled. And traditionally, the scouting force had been made up of cruisers. So if you've got a limited number of cruisers, and the ones that you do have are mostly needed as essentially anti-aircraft and close support platforms for the limited number of carriers you've got, well, the destroyers can fan out the limited numbers that you have, but they can't see anywhere near as far as cruisers could with their scout aircraft. So why not stick a cruiser-grade catapult and scout aircraft on a destroyer instead of one of its torpedo tube sets and the number 3 gun mount, and then you have a scouting capability on a little fleet scouting vessel. Sounds good, except for the fact it was hilariously unwieldy to operate and retrieve, unsurprisingly. And of course, by mid to late 1943, the US had a lot more carriers in service, new cruisers coming online, etc., which meant that the whole idea was very quickly shelved, and the destroyers in question, this particular one being USS Halford, were put back the way they had been supposed to be. Peter Guy asks, how did the gun crews in battleship barbettes coordinate the delivery of the shells and powder bags to the turrets? The powder bags and hoists were located on the lowest level of the barbette, and the shells and shell hoists were located on the middle levels of the barbette, each requiring many men to wrangle the powder bags and shells into the various hoists in a timely manner so the guns could fire their salvos at whatever rate of fire they were doing. How were they coordinated so the turrets didn't receive far more shells or far more powder bags than were needed to fire a salvo at any given time without causing a logjam, considering that the crews couldn't directly communicate with one another? There are a few different ways depending on the time period. So sometimes there was a basic communication system, not in the form of, telephone or something like that, although voice tubes were occasionally a thing, but you could just have an indicator of we need ammunition or we don't need ammunition. But in more practical terms, there are a couple of other ways. So on some battleship guns, the charges and the shells were part of a 2-section hoist, i.e., there's a single hoist system with 2 compartments. So you would load a shell into one section, and then it would go up and the charges would be loaded into the other section, or vice versa, depending on how your magazines were set up. And so you couldn't supply the wrong number of charges or shells because you were supplying the shell with all its charges as a single combined unit. Another way of doing things and to be honest, this would be in place even on that system, was simply a system of interlocks, because obviously you have flash doors and so forth, because you don't want a direct path all the way from the gun turret down into the magazine. And so each section of the hoist system would only accept one unit in it at a time, whether that be one shell or one set of charges or whatever. And it would have the system would have various stopping points along the way. So if there was nothing in the way, so the gun needs that particular lot, then it would obviously go all the way up, potentially stopping in a handling room immediately beneath the gun house, depending again on the battleship layout. But even if we assume a continuous course up, it's not like a rotating conveyor belt where you can say, okay, here's one set of charges, and now we can put another set of charges in 2 feet below the first set. There are only so many carriage units within the system. And as I said, they stop at different points. So if you have, for sake of argument, let's say 5 sets of charges in the hoist system, I don't know why you would have that in a single hoist system. It sounds incredibly dangerous, but let's imagine that you do. And so one set of charges is ready to roll out next to a gun. Another set of charges is perhaps one deck level below. And then another set of charges is a deck level below that. And so let's say your interlocks are at every deck level. Well, until the charges at the top of that cycle have been discharged and rolled out into the gun, well, into the tray and then into the gun, the whole system can't rotate. So you can be sitting there with as many charges as you like, and they ain't going anywhere because there's nowhere to put them once you sent the last lot on their way. And the similar thing with the shells. So at that point, if the guys up in the gun turret roll out a shell and your requisite 4, 5, or 6 charges, depending again on the gun, then the next set of charges and the next shell will lift up into place, and now there's a free slot at the bottom for fresh ammunition to be fed in. Eric Van Dooting asks, would any of the anti-aircraft guns on Japanese army vessels have been an upgrade over their contemporary on Japanese Navy vessels in World War II? And also, did you answer my question regarding Taiho last month? I am 99.9% sure I did answer. That was the question about the well decks of the aircraft elevators being under the waterline. I very definitely remember answering that. But with regards to your question from this month, not really. Japanese army vessels did have in common with the Japanese Navy the use of the 25mm Type 96, but, well, the less said about that, the better. Other than that, in terms of anti-aircraft armament, Japanese army vessels tended to either or have machine guns, which obviously, well, at least the 25mm, if it had the range to occasionally hit something and do some damage, the machine guns didn't even have the range. The other thing that seems to crop up quite a bit on Japanese army vessels is a 3-inch anti-aircraft gun, which would be relatively handy, but I think that overall it's probably a little bit too close in caliber to the 100mm AA gun that the Japanese Navy had, or dual-purpose gun, I suppose. And honestly, the Japanese 100mm was one of the best of the sort of heavy AA guns of the war, at least in and of itself. Obviously, it didn't have radar-assisted tracking or VT fuses and so on and so forth, but it was a pretty solid gun on its own. So, yeah, I don't think there's anything in particular that the Japanese Army had that would have helped the Navy in anti-aircraft protection, at least as far as what was on the Japanese Army's ships was concerned. Sworn brother of the Ballistic Order of St. John Moses Browning asks, regarding armoured conning towers, how well did they actually protect their occupants? Obviously a penetrating hit would be a bad day for everyone concerned, but even if the armour defeated the incoming shell, it still seems like you're basically standing inside a giant bell getting rung by battleship caliber projectiles. You think the energy transfer alone would be severely unpleasant to anyone inside. So how often are conning tower hits known to have happened, and what were the effects on the men inside them? So, yeah, conning towers are a particular bugbear of mine for pretty much the reasons you describe. When you look at the history of the conning tower, when they're actually brought into service, at that point, shells are, I wouldn't necessarily say smaller, because when the conning tower really takes hold, you're looking at the era of the much shorter barrel 12, 13, 17 and a half inch guns, 1870s, 1880s ironclad period. It starts off a little bit earlier, but it really takes hold in that point. But the main thing is, although those shells are still quite hefty, they are moving considerably slower, and they have significantly less armor penetration capacity, and also the explosive in them is less powerful. Now, as time goes on and you get into the pre-dreadnought, late pre-dreadnought, and then dreadnought periods, obviously the conning tower persists, and they keep putting more and more armor on it to theoretically withstand heavy shells. However, they have, when you do get hits, Battle of Tsushima, Bismarck, various others, for instance, you do get exactly the problem you describe. A heavy shell hit that hits a conning tower might not penetrate that conning tower, but it usually at best immobilizes everybody inside from the transmitted shock, and at worst you get spalling and fragments, with obviously the fragments coming in through the viewing slits and the spalling coming off the inside of the conning tower, pinging off and then bouncing back and forth inside and turning the interior into a blender for a brief period of time, which isn't really what the designers were intending. Now, I'm not, however, going to say that conning towers were entirely useless. I mean, mostly useless, yes, but not entirely. They do obviously quite badly restrict your vision, but I would say they are somewhat useful under three circumstances. The first is a near miss. Now, if you're out on the open bridge, as many captains will want to do, and a large shell hits nearby, let's say it hits a deck level below, hits the top of the turret in front of you, hits the mast or something, if you're on the open bridge, there's a decent chance that the blast and the shrapnel and the splinters might take you out or take a good chunk of the bridge crew out. If you're in a conning tower, that's not going to happen. Similarly, if you're under attack from either the secondary battery of a battleship or the guns of a cruiser or destroyer, then again, if you're on an open bridge, those guns could wipe you all out. If you're in a conning tower, yeah, it can probably tank those hits without too much issue. And the final situation is bombs. So, yeah, if your bridge takes a direct hit from a general purpose bomb, even if it's a little 250-pounder, you're probably all dead. Whereas if you're in a conning tower and a 250-pounder GP bomb hits the top of the conning tower, it'll ring your bell a little bit, but you will probably again be fine. So in those kinds of circumstances, you could argue that there are advantages to the conning tower, but if you get hit by an actual battleship shell in a battleship versus battleship engagement, you're a bit stuffed. In that case, you'd probably actually be better being on the bridge, because a shell that, let's say, would have passed 4 foot behind you probably won't have any significant deleterious effects on you if it just whizzes past the windows of a bridge, or whizzes past you on an open bridge. Okay, the shockwave might blow some windows out, but you should be fine mostly. Whereas if it would have gone 4 feet past you, but you're in a conning tower and it slams into the conning tower, yeah, you're not long for this world, most likely. But the flip side to the arguments that I just made about bombs and light guns and near misses and everything is, well, how much are you sacrificing in terms of visibility and command capability by being inside the conning tower? Would you have taken those hits anyway? Plus, of course, the bridge is also a fairly small target, just as much as the conning tower is. Lord Druken asks, when did the idea of a ship's brig become practical aboard a ship, and how were misbehaving sailors confined for offences that didn't require corporal punishment? So the ship's brig, as in a little prison aboard a ship, which could be used to confine prisoners, particularly sailors from the ship itself who were guilty of some misdemeanour, those really are a 19th century invention. They're only really possible once ships start to get somewhat larger, and therefore there is the space to put them, albeit somewhat limited space even so. You could knock up a brig if you absolutely had to, if you had a large number of prisoners to corral or someone who was particularly dangerous. But, well, if you had someone particularly dangerous aboard a ship, that's what summary justice was for, quite frankly, a lot of the time. On a ship like Mary Rose or Constitution or Victory, generally speaking, there just wasn't the space to confine someone or to dedicate to potentially having to confine someone. And also, there wasn't much use to it because, if you confine somebody for, a week or whatever, well, you still had to feed them. You still had to give them drink and all of that. It's just they didn't have to work. So what exactly was the punishment? I mean, you don't get freedom of movement, but let's face it, on a ship like that, those are the size of Age of Sail ships, there's not exactly a huge amount of freedom of movement anyway. So although you would get temporary brigs like the one that was knocked up on deck for the mutineers from HMS Bounty who were recaptured, it was generally only once ships got, the HMS Warrior size and above that you started to see permanent brigs. And as far as misbehaving sailors, if they are guilty of an offence that doesn't need corporal punishment, it was often dealt with then and there, either by a minor form of corporal punishment, or docking pay, or putting them on tough duties, or something like that. Fundamentally, the idea of confining somebody for an extended period of time, if they weren't a particularly valuable prisoner you were trying to ransom, is actually a very modern invention. Often if you go around a medieval castle, people are like, let's see the dungeons where all the prisoners were kept. Well, like I said, for the Age of Sail, keeping prisoners is expensive because you still got to feed and water them. They just can't do any useful work. So medieval prisons were very often just a place to store somebody until they could have a trial, and not much more than that. Actually, locking someone away and throwing away the key was a very unusual occurrence, and likewise on a ship, because, hey, what's going to be more effective as a punishment for both that person and for the ship? To make them not do work for a bit, but otherwise not a lot changes, or to make them do all the nasty, horrible hard work no one else wants to do? Nathapron Hong Sharon asks, the Indefatigables were famously under-armoured for a capital ship, with the apparent reason being cost. But how much more expensive would they have been if the Royal Navy was willing to drop a knot of speed and add 2 inches of belt armour over the magazines, given that Queen Elizabeth's and Hood had similar modifications, and they weren't that much slower than designed? I don't think they'd be much more expensive at all, and in fact, New Zealand and Australia kind of point the way. So Indefatigable, one of her supposed advantages, apart from being able to do a little bit more cross-deck firing, was that the belt extended all the way fore and aft, so she had some minimal high-explosive shell resistance along the entire waterline, at the expense, of course, of making the fore and aft magazines vulnerable to the very guns that, even as a battle cruiser against armoured cruisers, she was supposed to be able to resist, as I've pointed out many times before. It really was not a good choice, but with Australia and New Zealand, they reverted that change for the most part, and just by reverting that change, by getting rid of the fairly thin armour plate on the bow and stern, they were able to put the armour over the magazines up to 5 inches without any loss of speed compared to Indefatigable. It was just a rearrangement of weights. So I think if they'd wanted to put another, at that point, inch of armour over the magazines of A and Y turrets, with a tiny bit of finessing of the design, they probably wouldn't have lost any speed, or maybe a quarter knot at most. And to be perfectly honest, the cost increase would have been relatively minimal. About the only thing you would be sacrificing would be that absolute bow and stern end plating, which I suppose was a tactical choice when they were being designed, when they thought maybe that the era of HE or CPC equivalent shells being flung at the ship at either end and potentially causing flooding there might be a problem. But honestly, I think it was just the wrong choice. Todd Webb asks, if the Treasury decided to let the Royal Navy have the last cancelled R-class after World War I, how useful would another R-class built in 1919 and with no heavy war use have been going into the interwar years of World War II? So this would have been HMS Resistance. This is the launch of Revenge, because of course Resistance wasn't built, so therefore there are no photos of her. Now, I would be very conflicted over such a choice, because honestly, battleship design had moved on quite a bit by 1919, So while on the face of it, sure, having a brand new, fresh out of dock R-class with no machinery problems could have been seen as a good thing. One, I think it probably actually would have ended rather badly for the poor old Resistance, because being a relatively new vessel, I think she might have suffered a similar fate to Hood, because, well, she wouldn't have needed a refit quite as soon, which means that by the start of World War II, she would need a refit. She'd be just, a few months or a couple of years away from her machinery running itself into the ground, but she'd never have been given one because everybody else's machinery was wearing out first. And that could have wound up in a very bad way in World War II. The other big problem, ultimately, apart from the fact the R-class is a somewhat smaller hull and therefore less useful than a QE hull, is that even assuming you're building Resistance basically to an R-class plan, but with the knowledge and technology that have advanced during World War I, she is still an R-class. And when it comes to the Washington Naval Treaty and then the London Naval Treaties, that's going to cause a problem because, of course, the Royal Navy was able to argue for Nelson and Rodney. They'll probably still get those. But then they kept a rather nice, neat, balanced fleet, 5 Rs, 5 QEs, Renown, Repulse, Hood, Nelson, Rodney. Throw another R-class into the mix, and what's going to happen? Do you get rid of the oldest of the Queen Elizabeth class, but the Queen Elizabeth class are bigger and faster and potentially more useful in the future? Do you get rid of another one of the R-class, despite the fact they're 15-inch gunships and still relatively useful until a good chunk of the way into the interwar period? What do you drop, or do you negotiate the treaty in such a way as to include another 35,000 tons, or, 30 and a bit thousand tons, so that you can keep the Resistance in there as well? That, I think, would fundamentally be the problem. There's no good answer to really what do you get rid of, assuming everything else goes as planned. And if you include her within the treaty tonnage limits and later ship limits, well, now you're changing quite a bit about the naval treaties, which kind of expands the question quite considerably. And finally, 100 questions later, Reichspeer Minister asks, what are some lessons that had to be relearned by navies in the period that the channel covers, other than don't purge all the guys who know their stuff? There are some lessons that need to be learned with depressing regularity by various navies. Some of the basic ones, like, seniority does not in fact mean everything. And no, you shouldn't kick someone out of the Navy just because they made a relatively understandable mistake in the grand scheme of things for their rank, especially if they're, a somewhat junior officer, because both of those things either denied rank 2 for quite a while to the detriment of the Navy, or potentially could have got rid of officers who would go on to be extremely successful when the Navy actually needed them in times of actual combat. I've pointed to quite often the fact that Nimitz, when he was a young officer, ran his destroyer aground. You run your destroyer aground these days, or you run your destroyer aground in a Navy that's been around for quite a while in peacetime, you're out. So how's the Pacific War going if Nimitz is out? Another one is operational freedom of captains. And you see this time and time again. During war, eventually, unless you lose horribly and forget to learn from your loss, it's usually hammered into a Navy that you need to be able to trust your captains. You need to be able to give them freedom of action to a certain degree to act on their own initiative. That's how you win. Obviously, there have to be some regulations, and especially in a fleet action, you want to try and keep everyone together. But broadly speaking, a captain should have a fair degree of latitude. And then the more and more time a Navy spends in peace, the more and more time that gets reeled back in under closer and closer and closer control of flag officers, until the point where you're actually raising officers from midshipmen upwards with a view that they shouldn't think for themselves, that they should just act on the orders of the admiral in charge of the fleet, which A, means that when something goes wrong or an opportunity presents itself, they just don't do anything, and B, it's a very interesting point of view, because then suddenly, once they become admirals, these people who have basically been told do not think for yourself your entire life are now supposed to be the only person in the fleet who's actually thinking for themselves. Yeah, good luck figuring out how that was ever a sensible idea. And I would say probably the single biggest lesson that everybody needs to learn, and usually relearns to quite significant expense when a war breaks out or is about to break out, logistics is king, because again, during extended periods of peacetime, unless you have a very large and dramatic empire to defend, and sometimes even then, you very often see bases not being built, bases not being refurbished, equipment, stocks, spares all being drawn down to an absolute minimum, and the same thing often with things like barracks and accommodation for crews, simply because some treasury idiot is penny pinching and doesn't realise that the vast majority of money you invest into such things actually goes back into the economy, where you can tax it several times and probably therefore get most of it back. Instead, they just want a line item win for that month, and it all gets cut, and then along comes wartime and you have no ammunition, you have no spare parts, you have very few operational ships, and the operational ships you do have a fairly dispirited crew because they don't feel like they're being treated particularly well, and you're shocked as to why you do badly in a war. This happens time and 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 time again. And I'd argue some navies still haven't learned that lesson. But that brings us to the end for this week's Dry Dock. 6 hours and 10 minutes, and probably 6 hours 11 by the time I've finished talking here. 100 questions, but there you go. It's done. Enjoy. See you again in another video.